The great stone walls of the ivory citadel had stood for 1,000 years, a bastion of power and order in a world often shrouded in chaos. Within those walls, legends were born, treaties were signed, and the fate of kingdoms was decided. But for Alara, the castle was not a place of legend. It was a cage of silent suffering. Some evils are not monsters from the dark. They do not hide in forgotten tombs or shadowed forests. The most insidious evils hide in plain sight, clothed in the mundane, protected by systems of power, by the complicity of silence, and by the sheer, crushing weight of fear. For 3 long years, Alara had lived with such an evil. It festered in the castle kitchens, a place of steam and sweat and simmering pots, under the cold, watchful eye of Silas, the head overseer. He was a man who wore his authority not as a responsibility, but as a weapon. A beta who carried himself with the entitled cruelty of a corrupt alpha, Silas hurt those beneath him for the simplest of reasons, because he could. And because no one, in all the vast hierarchy of the citadel, had ever bothered to stop him. She bore the marks of his attention, these secret badges of her powerlessness. A dark, blossoming bruise on her ribs, carefully hidden beneath her coarse tunic. The lingering ache in her wrist from a grip that was far too tight. She was an omega, and in the rigid structure of the citadel's servant class, that meant she had no voice, no protection, no one who would care to look twice at her plight. She was invisible. There were 5 others like her. 5 other Omega women who moved through the kitchens like ghosts, their eyes perpetually downcast, their movements a study in avoiding notice. Lyra, with her nimble fingers that could peel a basket of apples in minutes. Cora, whose voice had once been known for its singing, now silent. Fenna, Isolde, and Gwen. They were a sisterhood of the damned, bound together by shared terror and a silent, desperate understanding. They all carried their own hidden wounds. They all knew the price of speaking out. 2 years ago, they had dared to hope. Fueled by a rare, collective spark of courage, all 6 of them had gone to the head steward, Lord Valerius. They had shown him the evidence etched onto their skin, the purple and yellow maps of Silas's cruelty. Lord Valerius, a man with a face as cold and smooth as marble, had listened with an expression of profound boredom. Then he had laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a soft, dismissive sound that was more devastating than any shout. He called them clumsy. He called them liars seeking attention. He told them they should be grateful for the discipline that kept them in line. The next day, Silas had found out. What he did to Lyra in the cold storage room, surrounded by hanging sides of meat, was a lesson written in pain. She couldn't walk for a week. The message was received, seared into their souls with the clarity of a brand. Never speak again. Just survive. So, they worked. They bled in silence. And in the deepest, most hidden corners of their hearts, they prayed for something, anything, to change. They did not know that change was coming. They did not dare to hope that it would arrive in the form of a king who noticed what everyone else had been trained to ignore. A king who saw the flicker of fear in a servant's eyes, the subtle flinch at a raised voice, the desperate attempt to hide what should never have been hidden. His name was Kaelin, and he was about to walk into their world and shatter it forever. Alara was 26. An orphan since 18, the Citadel's kitchens had been her reluctant sanctuary. The work was backbreaking, the hours endless, the pay a pittance that barely kept her clothed and fed. But it was survival. The heat from the great ovens was a constant presence, a physical weight that sapped her strength. The scent of baking bread, which should have been comforting, was to her just the smell of another 16-hour day. But the heat and the exhaustion were things she could endure. What was breaking her, piece by fragile piece, was Silas. He was 45, with thick, brutish hands and eyes that missed nothing, especially a mistake. A burned roast, a dropped tray, a moment's hesitation, any of these were pretexts for his wrath. For the beta and alpha servants, his discipline was sharp words or extra duties. For the omegas, it was something else entirely. It was a touch that lingered too long, a pinch that left a bruise, a correction that was nothing but an excuse for violence. Alara had become an artist of concealment. Long sleeves, even in the sweltering summer heat. High collars pulled tight. She had learned to arrange her hair, a plain brown curtain, to shield her face. She moved through the rooms with a quiet efficiency designed to make her a non-entity, a piece of furniture. To be noticed by Silas was to invite pain. To be invisible was to survive another day. The other Omegas had their own methods. Lyra had developed a limp that wasn't always there, a subconscious signal of her vulnerability. Cora kept her hands, often bruised from accidental collisions with doorframes, constantly busy or tucked into her apron. They communicated in glances, in the slightest shake of a head, a warning system built on shared terror. King Kaelin ruled from a world away. At 400 years old, he had guided his kingdom through 2 centuries of peace and prosperity. He was known to be fair, just, and deeply committed to the well-being of his people. But a kingdom is a vast and complicated machine, and a king cannot be everywhere. He trusted his stewards, his overseers, his counselors to manage the day-to-day affairs of the citadel. His focus was on the borders, on diplomacy, on the grand tapestry of the realm. The specific sorrows of 6 Omega servants in the kitchen were a world beneath his notice. The evil festering in his own home was a shadow he had never thought to look for. That changed on a day that began like any other. A section of the citadel's oldest wing was undergoing renovations, and Kaelin, a ruler who believed in seeing things for himself, was conducting a routine inspection. He moved through the halls with his chief architect, discussing stonework and reinforcements, his mind on budgets and structural integrity. His path, by chance or perhaps by fate, led him through the main kitchens. The moment he stepped through the arched doorway, the atmosphere shifted. The usual cacophony of chopping, boiling, and shouting died into a stunned, respectful silence. Every back bent into a deep bow. Murmurs of, "Your Majesty," rippled through the steam-filled air. Kaelin gave an absent-minded nod, his eyes scanning the room not for people, but for the new ironwork supports on the ceiling, the expanded hearth. It was all as it should be. He was about to turn and leave when a flicker of movement caught his attention. From the corner of his eye, he saw a young woman at a preparation table, her head whipping away from him with a speed that spoke of pure instinct. There was a furtive, fearful quality to the motion that was entirely out of place. And in that split second, before she turned, he saw it, the hurried yank of a sleeve down over a wrist, and the unmistakable, sickening bloom of a dark purple bruise marring her jawline. He stopped. The architect, confused, stopped beside him. "Your Majesty?" Kaelin's focus had narrowed to that one woman. "You," he said, his voice calm but carrying an alpha's natural command that froze the very air in the room. She went perfectly still, a rabbit sensing a hawk. She did not turn. A large man stepped forward, wiping his hands on a greasy apron. It was Silas. His face was a mask of obsequious respect, but his eyes were sharp with a sudden, nervous energy. "Your Majesty, please, pay her no mind. The Omegas are a clumsy lot. Always bumping into things. I assure you, it's nothing." Kaelin did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the woman's back. "I did not ask you," he said, his tone dropping a fraction, becoming dangerously soft. "I asked her. Come here." Tremors were visible in her shoulders. She moved slowly, as if walking through deep water, her head still bowed so low her chin nearly touched her chest. She stopped a few feet away, a picture of utter submission. "Look at me," Kaelin commanded. A tense silence stretched. Then, with a shuddering breath, she slowly lifted her head. Her hair fell away from her face, and the king saw the full truth. It was not just a bruise on her jaw. Her lip was split, swollen. The area around her left eye was a palette of angry purple and yellow, the eye itself squinted half shut. The marks were not from a fall. They were the clear, brutal imprint of a fist. A rage, pure and incandescent, ignited in Kaelin's chest. It was a feeling so immediate and so profound it stole his breath. It was more than a king's anger at injustice in his house. It felt personal. "Who did this to you?" The question was a low growl, resonating in the silent kitchen. She flinched, her eyes darting for a terrified instant towards Silas before fixing on the floor again. Her voice was a threadbare whisper. I fell, Your Majesty." "You fell," Kaelin repeated, the words flat and disbelieving. "And in falling, you gave yourself a black eye and a split lip that perfectly mirrors the shape of knuckles." She gave a tiny, desperate nod, clinging to the pathetic lie. Kaelin finally turned his head, his gaze sweeping over the other servants. He saw it then, what he had missed before. The averted eyes, the hunched shoulders, the pervasive, palpable fear that had nothing to do with respect for a king and everything to do with terror of the man standing beside him. His eyes locked onto Silas, who was now sweating despite the room's chill. "What is your name?" Kaelin's voice was like ice. "Silas, Your Majesty, head overseer of the kitchens." "And you run this kitchen?" "Yes, Your Majesty." "Tell me, Silas," Kaelin said, taking a slow step toward him. "How many Omegas work under your command?" Silas swallowed hard. 6, Your Majesty." "Line them up. Now." "Your Majesty, the midday meal, the preparations." Silas stammered. Kaelin took another step, and now his full alpha presence filled the space, a pressure that made the betas in the room gasp. "I will not repeat myself." Silas scrambled to obey, his face pale. He barked orders, and one by one, the 5 other Omega women were pulled from their stations. They formed a ragged line, a procession of the damned. Lyra, Cora, Fenna, Isolde, Gwen. All with their heads bowed, their postures screaming of shame and fear. King Kaelin walked down the line, his heart growing heavier with every step. He saw the yellowing bruise on Lyra's forearm, the way Cora favored one leg, the bandage wrapped clumsily around Fenna's hand. He saw the story of sustained, systematic abuse written on their bodies. "Raise your heads," he commanded, his voice gentler now, but no less firm. Slowly, reluctantly, they obeyed. And he saw their faces. Every single one. A fresh cut on Isolde's brow. The shadow of an old bruise on Gwen's cheekbone. The look in their eyes was the worst of it, a hollow, broken defeat that no one so young should ever possess. The simmering rage within him did not explode. It crystallized into something cold, hard, and infinitely more dangerous. His voice, when he spoke, was deathly calm. "It is interesting," he began, his eyes never leaving Silas's face, "that all 6 of the Omegas in your care bear such significant injuries. It would seem my kitchens are the most dangerous place in the entire Citadel. A remarkably clumsy group. No one dared to breathe." He turned back to the first woman, the one whose hidden pain had started it all. "What is your name?" "Alara, Your Majesty," she whispered. "Alara," he said, her name feeling strangely familiar on his tongue. He moved closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. The intensity in his gaze was not anger directed at her, but a fierce, protective promise. "I am not going to hurt you. I give you my solemn vow. But I need the truth from you now. Who hurt you?" Tears welled in her good eye, spilling over and tracing clean paths through the flour dusting her cheek. Her lips trembled, the words trapped behind a wall of terror built over 3 long years. Silas, sensing the precipice they were all standing on, tried one last time. "Your Majesty, this is highly disruptive. These simple creatures, they don't know their own minds." Kaelin didn't even look at him. "Guards." The 2 royal guards at the door snapped to attention. "Arrest this man." Silas's face contorted in shock and fury. "What? On what charges? This is an outrage. I am the head overseer." "The charges," Kaelin said, finally turning a gaze of pure, unadulterated fury upon him, "will be determined. But for now, you are charged with obstructing my royal inquiry. Take him to the dungeons." As the guards moved forward and seized Silas's arms, he began to struggle, his shouts echoing in the vast room. "You can't do this. Lord Valerius will hear of this. You'll see. This is not over." Kaelin watched him be dragged away, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to the 6 terrified women. The air in the kitchen was still thick with fear, but now, for the first time, there was a fragile, shimmering thread of something else. Something that felt like the faintest whisper of hope. "No one," Kaelin said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "will ever harm you for telling the truth. Not again. Not while I draw breath. You have the word of your king." He looked at Alara, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, their eyes met fully. In the depths of her fear, she saw not pity, but a resolve as solid as the Citadel's foundations. And he, in her broken gaze, felt that strange, profound connection twist deeper inside him, a pull he could not explain and dared not name. The investigation was about to begin. The shadows in the kitchen were finally being forced into the light. And King Kaelin knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his bones, that he was about to tear his entire court apart to uncover the truth. The silence in the kitchen after Silas was dragged away was more deafening than any noise it had ever held. It was a thick, heavy blanket of shock, of fear, of a hope so fragile the women were afraid to even breathe on it. Alara stood frozen, the king's final words echoing in her mind. You have the word of your king. She had heard promises before. They had always been broken. King Kaelin did not linger. With one last, inscrutable look at the 6 Omegas, he turned and strode from the kitchen, his guards falling into step behind him. The moment the great oak door swung shut, the spell was broken. A low, frantic murmur erupted among the Beta servants. They cast furtive, terrified glances at the Omegas, as if they were suddenly carrying a contagious plague. Lyra was the first to move. She stumbled to Alara's side, her good hand gripping Alara's arm. What have you done? She whispered, her voice raw with a fresh wave of terror. He'll be back. Silas will be back, and Lord Valerius, he'll make an example of us all. Cora wrapped her arms around herself, rocking slightly. He took him to the dungeons. The actual dungeons. He's the king, Fenna said, her voice small. Surely that means something. It means we are in more danger than ever, Lyra countered, her eyes wide with panic. We have drawn the eye of the most powerful man in the kingdom to our misery. Do you think Lord Valerius will allow that to stand? We are pawns in a game we do not understand, and we are about to be swept from the board. Alara finally found her voice, though it was trembling. He saw. The king, he truly saw. She touched her bruised jaw, the gesture unconscious. He knew it was not a fall. He looked at Silas, and he knew. But for how long? Isolde asked, her voice barely audible. A king's attention is a fleeting thing. He will grow bored, or be called away to more important matters, and we will be left here. Alone. Their fears were a living thing, coiling around them in the steam of the kitchens. The familiar routine of their oppression had been shattered, and the unknown that stretched before them was somehow more terrifying. The devil they knew had been dragged away, but the system that had created him, that had protected him, was still very much in place. Meanwhile, in the stark, stone-lined corridors of the royal wing, King Kaelin moved with a purpose that sent servants and courtiers scattering from his path. The cold, controlled fury that had settled in his chest was a focused fire. He did not go to his throne room or his private chambers. He went directly to the office of the captain of the royal guard, a man named Theron. Theron was an alpha of few words, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite and a loyalty to Kaelin that was absolute. He rose immediately as the king entered, taking in his sovereign's expression with a single, sharp glance. Your Majesty. Theron, Kaelin's voice was clipped. The head overseer of the kitchens, a man named Silas, is in the dungeons. I want him held in isolation. No one is to speak to him. No one. Not the guards, not the other prisoners, and especially not any member of the steward's staff. Is that clear? Perfectly, Your Majesty, Theron responded without hesitation. There is more, Kaelin continued, pacing the length of the room. I want you to select your most discreet, most trusted investigators. I want them to interview every servant in the kitchen. Start with the 6 Omega women. They are to be spoken to separately, in a secure and private location. Healers are to be brought to them first. I want every injury, every scar, every mark documented by our own physicians. I want a record. Theron's expression remained neutral, but a grim understanding dawned in his eyes. Abuse, sire? Systematic, brutal, and hidden in plain sight for years, under the authority of Lord Valerius. Kaelin stopped his pacing and fixed Theron with a hard stare. This investigation is to be conducted with the utmost secrecy. Valerius is not to know of it until we have an irrefutable case. Use the old scribe's quarters in the West Tower. Tell no one outside your chosen men. Theron gave a sharp nod. It will be done. Back in the kitchens, the dread was beginning to curdle into a strange, nervous anticipation. The Beta servants had been given temporary orders by a flustered undercook, but the usual driving force of Silas's cruelty was gone, leaving a void. The work felt disjointed, surreal. It was Lyra who first noticed the change in the air. Do you feel that? She whispered to Alara as they scrubbed pots. It's quiet. It was more than quiet. It was the absence of a specific, predatory energy. The constant, low-grade tension that had been the background music of their lives had vanished. Alara realized her shoulders were not hunched up around her ears. She was not listening for the specific cadence of his boots on the stone floor. A few hours later, the kitchen door opened again. But it was not Silas. It was Captain Theron and two other guards, their royal insignias gleaming. The room fell silent once more. Alara, Theron said, his voice not unkind, but firm. Please come with us. A fresh wave of terror washed over her. Lyra grabbed her hand, squeezing it tightly. This was it. They were being taken away, one by one, to be silenced. Please, Alara whispered, her legs feeling like water. You are not in any trouble, Theron said, a note of surprising gentleness in his rough voice. The king has ordered that you be seen by a healer. We are to escort you. A healer? Alara looked at Lyra, confusion warring with her fear. She had not seen a healer since she was a child. Such luxuries were not for Omegas. Reluctantly, she let go of Lyra's hand and followed the guards. They did not lead her to the dungeons or some dark cell. They took her up a series of winding staircases, away from the smoky, subterranean world of the kitchens, to a clean, sunlit room in the west tower. A kind-faced woman in healer's robes was waiting, along with a scribe holding a parchment and quill. The healer, whose name was Anya, spoke to her softly. Alara, my dear, my name is Anya. King Kalen has asked me to look you over. To make sure you are well. May I? It was the first time in years a stranger had asked for her permission. Alara could only nod, her throat tight with emotions she could not name. The examination was thorough and clinical. Anya documented everything. The fresh bruises on her jaw and ribs. The yellowing ones on her arms. The thin, white scar on her back from where a hot pan had, accidentally, brushed against her a year ago. The scribe wrote it all down in a neat, precise hand. As Anya worked, she asked quiet, simple questions. How did you get this mark, Alara? When did this happen? At first, Alara stuck to the old, practiced lies. I fell. I am clumsy. But Anya would just look at her, her eyes filled with a quiet, unwavering patience, and wait. The silence would stretch, and in that silence, the lies felt flimsy and pathetic. Tears began to stream down Alara's face, silent and unchecked. The dam of fear that had held her truth captive for so long was cracking under the weight of this unexpected kindness. It was Silas, she finally whispered, the confession feeling like a physical release. He was angry about the soup. He said it was too salty. The scribe's quill scratched against the parchment, etching her truth into an official record. One by one, the other Omegas were brought to the tower room. Lyra, Cora, Fenna, Isolde, Gwen. Their stories, whispered through tears and trembling hands, were all variations of the same nightmare. The documented evidence mounted, a tapestry of cruelty woven over years, detailed in injuries and signed with the names of the victims. Down in his study, King Kalen read the first of the preliminary reports Theron brought him. With each line, his face grew paler, his jaw tighter. It was worse, far worse, than he had imagined. The physical abuse was bad enough, but the reports spoke of psychological torment, of threats against their lives, of an environment of such profound terror that these women had been stripped of their very sense of self. And woven through the clinical descriptions was a name that appeared again and again, not as a perpetrator, but as the impenetrable shield: Lord Valerius. Any complaint, any whisper of dissent, had been met with dismissal and retaliation from the head steward. Kalen threw the parchment onto his desk, the pages scattering. He strode to the window, looking out over his kingdom, a kingdom he had believed to be just and orderly. How? He whispered to the gathering dusk. How did this happen under my roof? A soft knock came at the door. It was Elder Maeve, the ancient seer, her wise old eyes seeming to see right through him. You summoned me, Your Majesty? Kalen turned. Maeve, I need your counsel. There is a matter. An Omega servant. When I saw her, when I saw what had been done to her, the rage I felt was not normal. It was primal. It was possessive. He struggled to find the words. It felt as if someone had laid a hand on something that was mine. Maeve studied him for a long moment, her head tilted. And this feeling, this connection, does it persist? Even now, Kalen admitted, his voice low. Even when I am not near her, the thought of her pain, it is an ache. A constant, gnawing ache. The old seer moved closer, her gnarled hands clasped before her. There is an old magic that binds our world, your majesty. Older than crowns, older than castles. The bond of true mates. It does not care for status or station. It simply is. Kaelan stared at her, the air rushing from his lungs. Are you saying? I cannot say for certain without examining her, Maeve said gently. But what you describe, it is the pull of a dormant bond. Your soul has recognized its other half, even if your mind has not. It is why her pain is your pain. Why her suffering feels like a personal violation. The king sank into a chair, the weight of the revelation crushing him. His mate. His true, fated mate. And she had been suffering, bleeding, and breaking in the bowels of his own castle while he, oblivious, had focused on the grand affairs of state. The guilt was a physical blow, worse than any sword strike. What do I do? He asked, his voice hoarse. First, you must be the king, Maeve advised softly. You must bring justice. You must make her world safe. The bond cannot flourish in a garden of fear and trauma. It must be nurtured in safety and trust. You must heal the servant before you can even think of claiming the mate. Justice. The word echoed in his mind, cold and sharp. He looked at the scattered reports on his desk, at the names Silas and Valerius. He thought of Alara's bruised face, of the hollow fear in the eyes of the other women. Justice would not be a quiet affair. It would be a storm. And he would be the one to unleash it. The investigation was far from over, but the king now had a new, deeply personal stake in its outcome. The shadow in the kitchen had reached out and touched the very throne itself. And Kaelan would not rest until every last trace of that darkness was scoured from his halls by fire and steel. The citadel, for all its grandeur, was a creature of whispers. News did not travel through its vast, tapestry-lined halls on official proclamations alone. It slithered through cracks under doors, it floated on the steam from teacups in the servants' quarters, it was passed between knowing glances in the grand hall. The arrest of Silas was a tremor that quickly became an earthquake. A head overseer, dragged to the dungeons by the king's own guard? It was unprecedented. In the kitchens, the void left by Silas was filled with a nervous, electric energy. The other Omegas moved through their duties like sleepwalkers, their fear now tinged with a bewildered awe. Alara, especially, found herself the subject of furtive, curious stares. She was the one the king had spoken to first. She was the reason the world had tilted on its axis. Lyra stayed close to her, a silent, trembling sentinel. The beta servants are talking, Lyra murmured as they sorted through a sack of root vegetables. They say the king was in a fury unlike anything they've ever seen. They say he looked at you, differently. Alara's hand stilled on a grimy potato. Differently how? I don't know. Not like a master looks at a servant. It was more. Lyra shook her head, her own fear a palpable thing. It frightens me, Alara. This attention. We were safer in the shadows. But were they? Alara thought of the healer's gentle hands, of the clean, sunlit room in the west tower. She thought of the scribe, carefully writing down her words as if they mattered. That was not the action of someone who intended to silence her. A tiny, fragile seed of something that felt like trust began to germinate in the frozen soil of her heart. Meanwhile, in the opulent chambers of the head steward, Lord Valerius was not panicking. He was calculating. He sat behind a massive oak desk, his fingers steepled, his expression one of cold contempt. The news of his cousin's arrest was an inconvenience, a fly buzzing at the periphery of his well-ordered domain. He had received a tersely worded summons from the king, but he felt no fear. He had managed the citadel's domestic affairs for 50 years. He was indispensable. A few hysterical Omega servants were no match for his experience and authority. He summoned his most trusted aide, a beta as sly and silent as a shadow. The Omegas from the kitchen, Valerius said, his voice smooth as oil. Find out what was said in those interviews. Remind them of what happened to the last ones who tried to spread lies. A quiet word, a look. They will understand. The aide bowed and melted back into the corridors. Valerius leaned back in his chair. The king was a fool, playing at justice. He would soon learn that a kingdom was not run on ideals, but on order and a firm hand. A little fear was a necessary tool. King Kaelan, however, was not playing. Seated in his private council chamber with Captain Theron and Elder Maeve, he was building a case not just for punishment, but for systemic change. The testimonies are consistent and damning, sire, Theron reported, his voice grim. The physical abuse is documented beyond doubt. But it is the pattern of protection that is most alarming. Every Omega spoke of being dismissed and threatened by Lord Valerius when they tried to complain. He is the linchpin. Without his authority shielding Silas, none of this could have continued for so long. Kaelin's gaze was fixed on the middle distance, his mind working. And the other servants? The betas? Fearful, Theron admitted. They confirm the Omega's accounts of Silas's violence, but they are terrified of retaliation from the steward's office. They speak in hints and half-truths. They are a broken flock, sire. This cannot stand, Kaelin said, his voice low and deadly. A kingdom where its people live in terror of their overseers is a kingdom already rotting from within. He turned to Elder Maeve. You have seen Alara? I have, Your Majesty, Maeve said softly. From a distance, as you requested. The bond is there. Faint, like a faded watermark on parchment, but undeniable. Her spirit is strong, but it has been badly battered. To force the bond now would be to build a palace on cracked foundations. It would not hold. Kaelin nodded, the truth of her words a bitter pill. The primal part of him, the alpha who had found his mate, screamed to claim her, to surround her with his protection and erase every memory of pain. But the king, and the man he strived to be, knew that true healing could not be rushed. What does she need? He asked, the question raw. Safety, Maeve said simply. Not just the absence of danger, but the active, tangible feeling of it. She needs to see that the system that failed her has been irrevocably changed. She needs to see justice that is not just swift, but thorough. She needs to reclaim her own voice, and she needs time to learn that not all hands that reach for her intend to cause harm. Later that evening, a different kind of shadow fell over Alara. As she was carrying a bucket of scraps to the midden, a figure stepped out from an alcove, blocking her path. It was one of Valerius's men. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. The head steward sends his regards, the man said, his voice a low, unpleasant whisper. He trusts you remember the importance of loyalty. And the consequences of forgetfulness. The familiar, icy dread poured through Alara's veins, freezing the fragile new trust in its tracks. The world snapped back into the cruel focus she understood. The king's intervention was a temporary anomaly. The real power, the enduring power, still belonged to men like Valerius. She dropped her gaze, her entire body trembling. I remember, she whispered. Good. The man smiled, a thin, cruel slash. See that you do. He vanished as quietly as he had appeared, leaving Alara alone in the dim corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. The message was clear. The king's protection was an abstract concept. Valerius's reach was real, and it was here, in the shadows where she lived. The encounter shattered the small peace the healer's visit had brought. That night, lying on her thin pallet in the cramped servants' dormitory, she listened to the soft, fearful breathing of the other Omegas. The king's justice felt like a distant dream. Valerius's threat was the cold, hard floor beneath her. But a spark had been lit. As she replayed the moment in the kitchen, the intensity in the king's eyes, the absolute authority in his voice when he ordered Silas arrested, a rebellious thought, small but fierce, flickered to life. He saw me. It was a dangerous thought. Hope was the most dangerous thing of all. But it was there, stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. The next morning, Captain Theron requested a private audience with the king. His expression was grave. One of my men reported an incident last night, Theron said. One of Valerius's aides intercepted the Omega, Alara, and delivered what can only be construed as a threat. Kaelin's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a fire that made even the stalwart captain take an involuntary step back. He dared? He dares because he believes he is untouchable, sire, Theron said bluntly. He is testing you. He believes this is a passing fancy, that you will grow weary of playing the champion for kitchen maids. The alpha in Kaelin roared to the surface. The urge to storm into Valerius's office and tear him apart with his bare hands was nearly overwhelming. His mate had been threatened. The violation was intimate, profound. But he forced the rage down, channeling it into a cold, sharp focus. Double the guard on the investigation quarters, he commanded, his voice vibrating with controlled fury. Assign 2 of your most trusted men to watch over the 6 Omegas. Discreetly. I do not want them to feel like prisoners. But they are not to be approached, not by anyone outside of your designated investigators and healers. Is that understood? Perfectly, sire. And Theron, Kaelin added, his gaze turning to the window, towards the spire where the steward's offices were located. Prepare the Great Hall for an assembly. In 3 days' time, I will address the entire citadel. It is time the shadows learned that they cannot hide from the sun. The game was escalating. Valerius had made his move, a classic play of intimidation from the shadows. But Kaelin was no longer just a distant ruler. He was a king who had seen the face of evil in his home, and an alpha who had felt the echo of his mate's fear. He was about to change the rules of the game entirely. The whispers in the stone were about to be drowned out by a king's roar. 3 days. The citadel held its breath for 3 days. It was a pressure cooker of whispered rumors and sidelong glances. The official summons for a royal assembly in the Great Hall had been issued, and the air itself seemed to crackle with a dreadful anticipation. Everyone knew it was about Silas. Everyone knew the king's unprecedented involvement spelled a shift in the ancient order of things, but no one knew what form that shift would take. For Alara and the other Omegas, these 3 days were a strange and terrifying limbo. The constant, grinding fear of Silas was gone, but it had been replaced by a new, more nebulous anxiety. The king's guards were a quiet, watchful presence. They did not speak to them, but they were always there, a reminder that they were now pieces in a high-stakes game being played far above their station. The threat from Valerius's man hung over Alara like a shroud, a chilling counterpoint to the king's protection. She found herself looking at her own hands as she worked, at the faint scars and fading bruises. They were the map of her suffering, but for the first time, she wondered if they could also be the evidence of her deliverance. The king had not forgotten. The assembly was proof of that. But what would it mean? Would he simply reprimand Silas and reinstate him? The thought was a cold knot in her stomach. That would be a fate worse than before. Lyra, ever the pessimist, voiced their collective dread. He will give a speech about justice, she muttered as they kneaded dough, their hands moving in a tired, familiar rhythm. Then he will hand Silas back his authority, perhaps with a warning to be less harsh. And we will be left to pay the price for this temporary embarrassment. Cora, however, was beginning to waver. But the healer, the scribe, the king would not go to such trouble just to send us back to the wolves, would he? Kings do what is convenient, Lyra retorted, her voice bitter. And we are not convenient. We are a problem. Alara listened to them, her own thoughts a turbulent sea. She remembered the look in Kaelin's eyes. It wasn't the bland, detached benevolence of a ruler. It was a focused, personal intensity. It was the look of a man who had seen something that offended him to his very core. She clung to that memory, a lone, flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness of her fear. In his chambers, King Kaelin was preparing for the assembly with a cold, meticulous fury. He reviewed the compiled reports from Theron's investigators. They now included signed testimonies from 2 beta servants who, emboldened by the king's direct involvement, had finally broken their silence. They spoke of kickbacks to Valerius, of silenced complaints, of a culture of fear that started in the kitchens and reached up into the steward's office. The evidence was no longer just about bruised Omegas, it was about deep, systemic corruption. Elder Maeve entered quietly. The storm you are about to unleash will have far-reaching consequences, Your Majesty, she said, her wise eyes filled with both concern and resolve. It is a storm long overdue, Kaelin replied, not looking up from the parchment. A kingdom cannot be built on a foundation of rot. I have been blind, Maeve. I trusted the wrong people. I allowed this to fester. Guilt is a poor advisor, she said gently. Look forward. You are not just tearing down, you are building anew. What happens tomorrow will echo for generations. It will define your reign. He finally met her gaze. And Alara? She will be watching, Maeve said. They all will. They are not just waiting for justice for the past. They are waiting for a promise about the future. They need to see that your word is law, and that this law protects even the least of them. The morning of the assembly dawned gray and heavy, the sky a sheet of unbroken cloud that seemed to press down upon the citadel's highest towers. The great hall was filled to capacity. Nobles in silks and furs rubbed shoulders with merchants in fine wool, while servants, who were rarely permitted in the main hall, stood nervously at the very back. A palpable tension hummed in the air, a mixture of curiosity, anxiety, and for some in Valerius's faction, smug confidence. Alara, Lyra, Cora, and the others were brought in through a side entrance and placed in a secluded gallery, shielded by a carved stone screen. They could see the entire hall spread out below them, but they were largely hidden from view. It was a small mercy, a protection from the staring eyes of thousands. Then, the trumpets sounded. A fanfare that cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. Every head turned as King Kaelan entered. He did not wear his ceremonial crown. He was dressed in the functional, severe black of the royal military, a long sword at his hip. His expression was not one of regal benevolence but of grim purpose. This was not a celebratory address, it was a commander going to war. He walked to the center of the dais, his gaze sweeping over the assembled crowd. The silence was absolute, so profound you could hear the rustle of a banner high above. 3 days ago, his voice rang out, clear and hard, needing no magical amplification. I walked into my own kitchens and discovered a sickness in the heart of this citadel. A ripple went through the crowd. I found evil, he continued, the word landing with the weight of an anvil. Not an evil that hides in shadows, but one that operates in the open, protected by position, by power, and by the silence of those who looked away. I found 6 women, 6 omegas under my protection, who have endured years of brutality, of torment, of living in a state of terror so complete they had forgotten what it was to feel safe. He paused, letting the words sink in. From her hidden perch, Alara felt her heart hammering against her ribs. He was speaking of them. He was telling the entire kingdom their secret. The man responsible for this, the head overseer Silas, sits in my dungeons. Kaelan's voice dropped, becoming dangerously quiet. But he did not act alone. A poison like this requires a host. It requires a system that allows it to thrive. It requires protection from on high. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found their target. Lord Valerius. Step forward. A gasp echoed through the hall. Lord Valerius, who had been standing with a placid, confident expression, went pale. But he was a master of composure. He smoothed his robes and stepped out from the ranks of the nobility, bowing with practiced grace. Your Majesty, he said, his voice oily and smooth. I am, as always, at your service. I assure you, whatever these individuals have claimed, there has been a misunderstanding. The management of servants is a complex matter. They are prone to exaggeration, to hysteria. Be silent. The king's command was not a shout. It was a low, resonant order that vibrated in the very stones of the floor. Valerius's mouth snapped shut, his eyes widening in shock. He was not used to being spoken to in such a manner. Kaelan descended from the dais, walking slowly towards the steward until he stood mere feet from him. The entire hall watched, breathless. I have the sworn testimonies of 6 omegas, detailing years of abuse at the hands of your cousin, Silas, Kaelan said, his voice cold as ice. I have the corroborating accounts of other servants. I have the documented evidence of their injuries, examined by my own royal healers. And I have the record of every complaint brought to you, which you systematically dismissed and punished. Valerius began to sweat. Your Majesty, I merely sought to maintain order, you sought to maintain your power. Kaelan's voice rose for the first time, thundering through the hall. You protected a monster because it served you. You allowed innocent women to be broken and terrorized because their suffering was a price you were willing to pay for a quiet, compliant kitchen. You are not a steward of my house, you are a parasite upon it. The accusation hung in the air, stark and undeniable. Valerius's mask of civility finally cracked. You would take the word of lying omegas over mine? I who have served this crown for 5 decades. I take the word of truth. Kaelan roared. And the truth is that you are complicit in every bruise, every broken bone, every moment of terror those women have endured. You are as guilty as Silas himself. He turned his back on the sputtering steward and addressed the crowd once more. Let it be known today, to every person in this kingdom, high-born and low-born alike. The law is not a tool for the powerful to wield against the weak. It is a shield for the powerless. And I am its keeper. He looked up towards the gallery where the omegas were hidden, as if he could see Alara through the stone. Your silence has been broken. Your suffering has been seen. And today, it ends. He turned to Captain Theron. Arrest Lord Valerius. Charge him with corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm." As the guards moved forward, the great hall erupted. It was not a cheer, not yet. It was a massive, collective exhalation of shock. They were witnessing the unthinkable. A king tearing down his own administration in the name of a handful of servant girls. Alara watched, her hands pressed to her mouth, as the mighty Lord Valerius was dragged away, his shouts of protest lost in the din. The world had not just tilted, it had been flipped entirely upside down. The man who had been an untouchable god in their small world had been cast down in front of everyone. Lyra was crying silent tears of shock next to her. Cora was gripping her arm so tightly it hurt. King Kaelin stood alone on the dais, the storm of his own making swirling around him. He had publicly executed the old order. But as Alara looked at his solitary, resolute figure, a new fear, cold and clear, settled in her stomach. He had made enemies today. Powerful enemies. And he had done it for them. The storm had been unleashed, but now they were all caught in its path. The battle for justice was won in the Great Hall, but the war for the soul of the kingdom had just begun. The silence that fell after Lord Valerius was dragged from the Great Hall was more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a world reordered, of foundations shaken. The assembled nobles, merchants, and servants stared at their king, their faces a mosaic of shock, fear, and for some, a dawning, fierce approval. The king had not just punished a corrupt official, he had drawn a line in the sand of the entire kingdom. King Kaelin did not linger to bask in the reaction. With a final, sweeping glance that seemed to impress his will upon the very air, he turned and strode from the dais, the guards falling into step around him. The spell was broken, and the hall erupted into a cacophony of voices, 100 conversations exploding at once. In the secluded gallery, the 6 Omegas were frozen. Lyra's tears traced clean paths through the fine layer of kitchen dust on her cheeks. Cora's grip on Alara's arm was a vice of disbelief. "He did it," Fenna whispered, the words a prayer. "He actually did it. He arrested Lord Valerius," Isolde echoed, as if trying to convince herself. The head steward. "He's gone." Alara could not speak. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs, a frantic, hopeful, terrified rhythm. She had seen the look on Valerius's face, the sheer, unadulterated shock as his invincibility shattered. The king had not just seen her pain, he had torn down a pillar of his own court because of it. The weight of that was immense, terrifying. What did it mean? Why would a king go so far for them? Their answer came in the form of Captain Theron, who appeared at the entrance to their gallery. His expression was as stern as ever, but there was a new respect in his eyes when he looked at them. "The king has ordered that you be moved to new quarters," he announced. "You will no longer sleep in the servants' dormitory. You are to be housed in the Rose Wing, under royal protection, until the full trial is concluded." The Rose Wing. It was a part of the castle reserved for esteemed guests, for visiting diplomats. It was a world of sunlight and tapestries, a world they had only ever cleaned. A fresh wave of disbelief washed over them. This was not a return to the shadows. This was a promotion into the light. They were escorted, a silent, dazed procession, through corridors they had never walked, up staircases that were wide and clean. The rooms they were given were simple but beautiful, each with a real bed, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the castle gardens, not the soot-stained courtyard of the kitchens. It was overwhelming. Left alone in her new room, Alara sat on the edge of the soft mattress, running her hands over the clean wool blanket. The silence here was different. It wasn't the fearful silence of the kitchens, but a peaceful, secure one. She could still feel the ghost of Silas's grip on her wrist, but here, in this room, the memory felt distant, like a bad dream. But kings do not act without consequence. As the Omegas settled into their bewildering new reality, the ripples of Kaelin's actions were spreading through the citadel's power structure. In the council chambers, a faction of older nobles, men who had served with Valerius for decades, gathered in hushed, angry tones. "This is an outrage." Lord Bourdon, a grizzled alpha with vast landholdings, slammed his fist on the table. "To publicly humiliate and arrest the head steward on the word of servants? It undermines the entire chain of command. What is next? Will our stable boys dictate policy?" He is being swayed by sentiment, another lord, Morin, agreed, his face pinched. And Omega's tears have clouded his judgment. This office of protection, he spoke of? It is an invitation for chaos, for every disgruntled servant to make baseless accusations against their betters. They saw Kaelin's justice not as righteousness, but as a dangerous instability. Their power, built on tradition and the unassailable authority of their class, felt threatened. However, they were not the only voices. A younger lord, who had been listening quietly from the window, finally turned. His name was Evander. He was not yet 30, but he had a reputation for sharp intellect and a quiet charisma. He had always found Valerius's rule to be stifling and cruel. With respect, my lords, Evander said, his voice calm but firm. The king did not act on an Omega's tears. He acted on evidence. Documented, sworn evidence of years of horrific abuse that happened under our very noses. If the chain of command allows for such evil to flourish, then perhaps it is a chain that needs to be broken and reforged. Lord Bourdon scoffed. You are young, Evander. You see a noble cause. I see a crack in the foundation. And cracks, if not repaired, bring down the entire structure. Or they let in fresh air, Evander countered. The king is not undermining authority, he is reclaiming it. He is reminding us that true authority comes from justice, not from fear. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other nobles. I, for one, stand with the king. His declaration created a fissure in the council. It was no longer a unified block of disapproval. Kaelin had an ally, and a powerful one. Meanwhile, Kaelin himself was in his war room with Theron and Elder Maeve, dealing with the practical fallout. The trial for Silas and Valerius will be in 1 week, Kaelin stated. It will be public. I want no one to ever doubt the evidence or the verdict. The nobles are restless, sire, Theron reported. Lord Bourdon is rallying opposition. But Lord Evander has declared his support. Kaelin nodded. Evander is a man of principle. His support is worth more than a dozen Bourdons. He then turned to the more pressing concern. And the Omegas? How are they settling? They are safe, but bewildered, Maeve answered. They have been given safety, but not purpose. Idleness can be its own prison, especially for minds accustomed to survival. They need a path forward, not just a comfortable cage. Kaelin considered this. He knew she was right. He could not simply hide them away. He had to help them rebuild their lives. The next day, he sent a request, not a command, for Alara to join him in the royal gardens. When she arrived, escorted by a guard, she found him not on a throne, but standing by a reflecting pool, looking strangely vulnerable. Alara, he said, turning as she approached. Thank you for coming. I wished to speak with you away from the eyes of the court. She bowed her head, her heart thudding. Your Majesty. Please, he said, a note of something almost like pleading in his voice. There is no need for that here. I want to know how you are. Truly. She dared to look at him then. The fierce king from the great hall was gone. In his place was a man who looked tired and earnest. I am well, she stammered. The rooms, they are, thank you. It is the least that is owed to you, he said, his gaze intense. But safety is only the beginning. I do not want you and the others to simply be passive recipients of my protection. I want to know what you want. When you look to the future, what do you see? The question stunned her. No one had ever asked her what she wanted. Her entire life had been about enduring what she was given. She looked out over the tranquil garden, at the carefully tended roses. I do not know, she admitted, her voice small. I have never been allowed to want anything before. Her honesty struck him deeply. Then that is where we will start, he said softly. I am establishing a new council, to advise on the welfare of all castle staff, regardless of rank or designation. I would like you, and any of the others who are willing, to be a part of it. Your voices, your experiences, will guide its work. He was offering her not just shelter, but a voice. A role. It was more terrifying, and more empowering, than any room in the Rose Wing. As they walked slowly along the garden path, a comfortable silence fell between them. For the first time, Alara felt not like a victim in the presence of her savior, but like a person in the presence of another person. The strange, magnetic pull she felt towards him was still there, a low, warm hum in her blood, but the fear that had always accompanied it was beginning to recede, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning curiosity. The king had won a great victory in the hall. But here, in the quiet of the garden, he was fighting a different, more subtle battle, the battle for her trust. And he was patient enough to know that this was a battle that could not be won with a sword, but only with time, honesty, and the quiet courage to ask a simple, world-changing question. What do you want? The week that followed was a strange interlude, a pocket of calm in the raging storm King Kalan had unleashed. For Alara and the others, life in the Rose Wing was a dream from which they feared they might wake at any moment. They were served meals they did not have to cook. They slept through the night without the gnawing fear of a hand on their shoulder. The silence was not something to be feared, but to be savored. Yet, peace was a foreign country, and they were uneasy immigrants. Lyra paced her room like a caged animal, the lack of hard labor making her restless and anxious. "This is a gilded cage," she insisted to Alara one afternoon. "He placates us with soft beds while he decides our true fate." Cora, however, was beginning to bloom in the sunlight. She had found a small, forgotten lute in a corner of the common room and was tentatively plucking the strings, the notes hesitant but sweet, like the first birdsong of spring. The sound was a balm to Alara's soul. Alara herself was consumed by the king's question. "What do you want?" It echoed in her mind, a riddle with no easy answer. She wanted to never be afraid again. She wanted the other Omegas to be safe. She wanted to look at her own reflection without seeing a victim. These were feelings, not plans. How did one translate survival into a desire? King Kalan was equally preoccupied, but his battles were fought in council chambers and through missives carried by swift riders. Lord Bourdon's faction was proving stubborn, using procedure and tradition to slow-walk the king's new initiatives. The public trial for Silas and Valerius was set, but Bourdon argued for a closed proceeding, to avoid further scandal and unrest. "It is the public nature of the scandal that demands a public resolution," Kalan countered, his patience wearing thin. "The people must see that justice is blind, that it falls upon the high-born and the low-born alike when they break the law." It was Lord Evander who provided the crucial leverage. "The merchants' guilds have heard of your actions, Your Majesty," he reported during a private meeting. "They see it as a sign of stability. A kingdom where the law is supreme is a kingdom where trade can flourish. Their support is quietly shifting to you. Bourdon's power is rooted in land, but the future of the kingdom is rooted in commerce. Do not underestimate your position." Bolstered by this, Kalan stood firm. The trial would be public. Furthermore, he formally announced the formation of the new advisory body, the Citadel Welfare Council. The announcement named several respected Beta officials, Lord Evander, and, to the guests of the court, representatives from the serving staff, to be chosen from among their own ranks. The message was unmistakable. The old ways were over. The day of the first council meeting arrived. Alara, chosen by the other Omegas who were still too timid to speak, walked into the chamber with legs that felt like water. The room was dominated by a large, oval table of polished dark wood. Lord Evander offered her a small, encouraging smile. The Beta officials looked on with cautious curiosity. But it was King Kalan's presence that anchored her. He sat at the head of the table, not as a looming monarch, but as a facilitator. He did not crown or robes, he was dressed as a working ruler. "Welcome," he began, his voice calm and inclusive. "This council's purpose is simple: to ensure the dignity, safety, and fair treatment of every soul who lives and works within the Citadel. We cannot govern what we do not understand. So, today, we listen." The meeting began with discussions of wages, of work hours, of grievance procedures. Alara listened, her mind reeling at the concepts. Paid sick leave? A formal process for complaints that bypassed immediate overseers? They were discussing a world that was the complete opposite of the one she had known. Then, Lord Evander turned to her. "Alara, your perspective is the most vital one in this room. From your experience, what is the single most important change that could have prevented what happened to you and the others?" All eyes turned to her. The weight of their gazes was immense. She felt the old instinct to shrink, to mutter, "I don't know," and disappear. But she thought of Lyra's restless pacing, of Cora's silent songs, of the faded bruises on her own arms. She thought of the king's question in the garden. She took a shaky breath. "The silence," she said, her voice barely above a whisper at first, then growing stronger as she found the words. It was the silence that let it happen. We were isolated. Silas made sure of it. The most important change would be to break the silence. Not just with a place to report, but with a way for us to know each other. To talk. Without fear. If we had been able to meet, just once a week, to speak as we are now, he could not have turned us against each other. We would have known we were not alone. She looked around the table, her heart pounding. It is not just about rules on parchment. It is about connection. That is what he took from us. That is what we need to get back. A profound silence filled the room. The Beta officials looked thoughtful. Lord Evander nodded slowly, a look of deep respect on his face. King Kalen looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw not pity, nor even just approval, but something deeper, a recognition. She had not asked for a bigger room or more coin. She had asked for the one thing a tyrant fears most, a community. That, Kalen said, his voice soft but resonant, will be the first official recommendation of this council. The establishment of regular, protected gatherings for all staff, by designation and by wing, to foster communication and solidarity. No overseer shall have the power to forbid it. It was a small thing, a simple thing. But to Alara, it felt more revolutionary than any execution. It was a weapon against the loneliness that had been Silas's greatest tool. After the meeting, as the others filed out, Kalen gestured for her to stay. "You were remarkable," he said. "You saw the heart of the matter." "It was just what I felt," she replied, still trembling from the ordeal. "Feeling is the beginning of wisdom," he said. "Do not ever discount it." He hesitated, then added, "The trial begins tomorrow. It will be difficult. You will be asked to testify. The defense will try to shake you, to make you doubt your own memory. But I want you to know that no matter what is said in that courtroom, what you accomplished in this room today is already a victory. You have begun to build the world you deserve." As she left the chamber, Alara felt a new sensation, unfamiliar and powerful. It was a sense of agency. She had spoken, and the world had shifted. The king had given her a platform, but she had found her own voice. The path from victim to survivor was long, but she had taken the first, most terrifying step. She had chosen to be heard. And in the quiet of the citadel, the allies of the old regime heard the echoes of that step, and they knew that the king's new world was not being built by decree alone. It was being built, brick, by the courage of those who had once been silent. The day of the trial dawned with a solemn gray light. The great hall, which had witnessed the shocking arrest of Lord Valerius, was now transformed into a court of law. Banners hung still and heavy. The king's seat was not a throne but a simple, high-backed chair at the center of the dais, flanked by Captain Theron and the kingdom's most senior, impartial judge, a man named Orin who was known for his unshakable integrity. The air was thick with a tense, breathless anticipation. The accused, Silas and Lord Valerius, were brought in separately, both in chains. Silas looked diminished, his brutish confidence replaced by a sullen, terrified glare. Lord Valerius, however, had used his time in confinement to perfect a mask of wounded dignity. He held his head high, his expression one of a great man grievously wronged, his gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles as if seeking their silent solidarity. Alara, Lyra, Cora, and the others were seated together in a shielded section, guarded by Theron's most trusted soldiers. They were not spectators, they were the central pillars of the case about to be presented. Alara's hands were clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. This was the moment she had dreaded for years, the moment of speaking her truth in a place where lies had always been currency. King Kalen did not preside over the testimony. He had recused himself to avoid any accusation of bias, taking a seat in the front row of the observers. But his presence was a tangible force, a silent promise that the old rules of power would not apply today. The trial began with the prosecution, led by a stern-faced woman named Magistrate Liana. She laid out the case with cold, methodical precision. She presented the healer's reports, the detailed maps of bruises and scars. She called the beta servants who, with nervous voices, confirmed the pattern of violence and the culture of fear. The evidence was a relentless tide, each piece locking into the next, building an undeniable picture of cruelty. Then, it was time for the Omegas. Lyra was called first. She walked to the witness stand on trembling legs, her voice a fragile thread as she described the beating she received after their failed complaint to Valerius. The defense, a slick-tongued lawyer retained by Valerius's allies, immediately went on the attack. Is it not true, witness, that you are prone to falls? That you have always been clumsy? He asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Lyra flinched, the old lies used to discredit them now being wielded as a legal strategy. I am not clumsy, she whispered. Speak up. The court cannot hear you if you mumble like a frightened child. Or are you unable to speak clearly because your story cannot hold up to scrutiny? From his seat, Kaelin's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. This was their battle to fight. Interfering would only validate the defense's claim that this was a sham. Lyra, under the brutal questioning, began to fold in on herself, her testimony becoming hesitant and confused. She was led away in tears, and a murmur of sympathy mixed with doubt rippled through the crowd. The defense had drawn first blood. Cora was next. She spoke of the constant, low-grade hum of terror, of the casual shoves and the threats whispered in her ear. The defense lawyer switched tactics, attempting to paint her as hysterical. You admit you were afraid, he said, pacing before her. Fear can distort memory, can it not? Make small incidents seem large? Perhaps what you remember as a blow was merely a firm guiding hand. Cora's eyes filled with frustrated tears. I know the difference between a guide and a fist, she said, her voice shaking with a sudden, surprising fire. I have the memory of both etched into my bones. It was powerful, but the lawyer simply smiled, as if her emotion proved his point. No further questions. One by one, the others testified. Fenna, Isolde, Gwen. The defense picked at their stories, highlighting minor inconsistencies that are natural in trauma recall, trying to twist their fear into proof of deception. The solid foundation of truth the prosecution had built was being chipped away, not by facts, but by insinuation and the deep-seated prejudice of those in the hall who did not want to believe that such things could happen. Then, they called Alara. A hush fell over the hall as she walked to the stand. She could feel the weight of 1,000 eyes upon her. She saw Silas's hateful glare and Valerius's cold, calculating stare. And then she saw Kaelin. He gave no smile, no nod of encouragement. He simply looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering, a rock in a stormy sea. In that look, she felt a surge of strength. He believed her. He had already proven it with his actions. This was just the formalities. She took her seat and swore the oath, her voice clear and firm. Magistrate Lyanna began gently. Alara, please tell the court about the day King Kaelin came to the kitchens. Alara took a deep breath. She did not look at the lawyers or the nobles. She looked at the middle distance and spoke, not in the timid whisper of a servant, but with the quiet authority of someone recounting a simple, terrible truth. She described the fear, the instinct to hide, the feeling of the king's gaze upon her. She described the lie she told, and the chilling reason for it. I lied because I knew that telling the truth had a price, and I was not the only one who would have to pay it. Then it was the defense's turn. The lawyer approached her with a smug smile, thinking she would be as easily rattled as the others. You are the one who started all this, are you not? He began. The king's attention fell upon you, and you saw an opportunity. An opportunity for what? Alara asked, her voice calm. To better your position, of course. To escape the kitchens. To gain favor. You have a room in the Rose Wing now, do you not? A far cry from the servants' quarters. A handsome reward for a compelling story. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and plausible to those who wanted to believe it. Alara did not get angry. She did not cry. She looked directly at the lawyer, and then she slowly, deliberately, turned her gaze to Silas. No reward is handsome enough to be worth what he did, she said, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. No room is comfortable enough to make me forget the feel of his hands on me. You speak of opportunity. The only opportunity I saw that day was the opportunity to finally breathe without tasting fear. The king did not offer me a reward. He offered me a question. Who hurt you? And for the first time in 3 years, I believed someone might actually care about the answer. The lawyer, thrown by her composure, pressed on. You expect this court to believe that a man of Lord Valerius's standing would involve himself in the petty squabbles of the kitchen? Alara's eyes shifted to Valerius. He did not involve himself in the squabbles. He enforced the silence. He was the wall that every cry for help crashed against. That is not a petty thing. That is the architecture of hell. A stunned silence met her words. The lawyer, for the first time, was at a loss. Her testimony had not been that of a hysterical victim or a cunning opportunist. It had been the testimony of a witness who had stared into the abyss and was no longer afraid to name it. She had not just given evidence, she had given the court a moral compass. The defense's attempts to dismantle her credibility now seemed cheap and cruel. The tide of the trial, which had been turning, shifted irrevocably. The truth, spoken with clarity and courage, had become an unstoppable force. The crucible had not broken her, it had forged her into something unbreakable. And in that moment, everyone in the great hall knew that the world had truly, fundamentally, changed. The silence that followed Alara's testimony was a living entity, thick and heavy with the weight of her unassailable truth. The defense lawyer, his smug confidence shattered, could only mutter a perfunctory, "No further questions," and retreat to his table. He knew he had been defeated not by legal trickery, but by the raw, unvarnished power of a story that could not be twisted. Magistrate Liana stood for her redirect, but she simply looked at Alara and gave a slight, respectful nod. The prosecution rests its case with this witness. There was little left for the defense to present. They called a few minor officials who spoke in vague terms of Valerius's efficiency and Silas's firm management, but their words sounded hollow and evasive next to the specific, harrowing accounts of the Omegas. Valerius himself declined to testify, a calculated move that spoke volumes. His mask of dignity had cracked, revealing the cold calculation beneath. He knew a performance would not save him now. Finally, the time came for closing arguments. The defense lawyer gave a florid speech about the dangers of appending tradition on the word of hysterical servants, about the importance of trusting one's appointed stewards. But the words rang empty, bouncing off the stone walls without finding purchase in the hearts of the listeners. Then Magistrate Liana rose. She did not pace or gesture dramatically. She stood calmly before the dais, her hands clasped. "We are not here today to debate the management of a kitchen," she began, her voice clear and resonant. "We are here to answer a single, fundamental question. Does the law of this kingdom protect everyone, or only the powerful? The evidence presented is not a matter of opinion. It is a record of bruises, of scars, of sworn testimony from multiple, corroborating witnesses. It is a record of a system designed not for order but for terror." She turned and pointed a steady finger at Silas. This man used his power as a weapon. He inflicted pain not for discipline, but for pleasure, for the sheer exercise of control. Her finger then swung to Valerius. And this man provided the shield. He was the guardian at the gate, and he allowed a monster to prey upon the innocent for years. He did not merely fail in his duty, he was an active accomplice to the evil that festered under his watch. She paused, letting her gaze sweep over the assembled court. "You have heard the attempts to discredit these women. You have been asked to believe they are clumsy, hysterical, opportunistic. But you have also looked into their eyes. You have heard the quiet, unwavering courage in their voices, especially in the voice of the final witness. They are not on trial here. The ones on trial are the men who betrayed the sacred trust of their positions. The only verdict that upholds the law, the only verdict that honors the king's oath to protect every citizen, is guilty." She sat down. In the profound silence that followed, Senior Judge Oren instructed the members of the noble jury, a mix of those loyal to the old ways and those sympathetic to the new, to deliberate. The wait was an agony. Alara was led back to the side chamber with the others. They did not speak. Lyra clutched her hand, her earlier cynicism replaced by a desperate, hopeful anxiety. Cora hummed a soft, nervous tune. They had done all they could. Their truth was now in the hands of others. King Kaelin remained in his seat, a statue of royal authority. Inside, however, a war raged. This was the moment of truth for his reign. A verdict of "not guilty" would not only free two monsters but would shatter the fragile trust he was trying to build and embolden his enemies beyond measure. It would be a declaration that the old corruption was too deeply rooted to tear out. The deliberation was shorter than anyone expected. Within the hour, the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable. Judge Oren addressed them. "Foreman of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" A stern-faced Alpha Lord stood. "We have, Your Honor. On the charge of grievous bodily harm, systematic abuse, and torture against the accused, Silas, how do you find?" "Guilty." A wave of murmurs swept the hall. "On the charge of corruption, abuse of power, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm against the accused, Lord Valerius, how do you find?" The foreman's voice did not waver. "Guilty." The words landed like a physical blow. A collective gasp, then a roar of reaction filled the hall. Silas screamed a stream of profanities before being forcibly silenced by the guards. Lord Valerius simply closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The mask was gone, replaced by the ashen face of a man who had lost everything. Judge Oren banged his gavel for order. "Silence. This court will come to order." When the noise subsided, he turned to King Calin. "Your Majesty, the court has rendered its verdict. The sentencing is yours to decree, according to the ancient laws of the land." Every eye turned to the king. He rose slowly, his presence commanding immediate silence. He looked first at Silas, his expression one of pure, unadulterated contempt. "Silas, you were given authority over the most vulnerable in my house, and you used it to feed your own cruelty. You are a blight on the very concept of order. The penalty for your crimes is death. You will be taken from this place at dawn and executed by the sword. May the gods have mercy on your soul, for you showed none to those in your care." Silas was dragged away, his curses turning into ragged sobs of terror. Calin then turned his gaze to Valerius. The fallen steward opened his eyes, a flicker of his old arrogance returning. He likely expected exile, imprisonment in a comfortable estate, a punishment befitting his status. "Lord Valerius," Calin's voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. "Your crime is in some ways greater than his. You were not a brutish enforcer, you were a man of intellect and influence. You understood the system perfectly, and you chose to pervert it. You were my trusted steward, and you betrayed that trust to protect a predator. You allowed evil to flourish for the sake of your own power and a quiet life. You did not wield the fist, but you ensured no one would hear the cry of its victims. For that, there can be no leniency." Valerius's eyes widened in shock. "The penalty for corruption that leads to the profound suffering of others," Calin declared, his voice ringing with finality, "is also death. You will face the same fate as the monster you enabled. Let it be a lesson to all who hold power in my name. With great authority comes even greater accountability." There are no exceptions. The hall erupted. This was beyond anything they had imagined. The king had not just condemned a lowly overseer, he had executed the highest-ranking noble ever convicted of a crime. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power. As Valerius was led away, stunned into silence, Calin addressed the hall one last time. "The gavel has fallen. Justice has been served. But let it be known that this is not an end. It is a beginning. The work of rooting out corruption and ensuring the dignity of all begins now." This court is adjourned. In the side chamber, the 6 Omegas wept, but this time, their tears were of release, of a burden finally, irrevocably lifted. The shadow that had haunted them for years was gone, not just banished, but annihilated. Alara looked through the doorway at Calin as the crowd slowly dispersed. He stood alone for a moment, the weight of the 2 death sentences he had just passed evident in the set of his shoulders. He had done it. He had burned the old, rotten structure to the ground. And as she watched him, the fragile, burgeoning trust within her blossomed into something else, something warmer and far more profound. It was the first, faint shimmer of faith. Not just in a king, but in the man. The great hall emptied slowly, the stunned silence giving way to a low, relentless hum of conversation that would soon spill out into the city streets and beyond. The news would travel on the wind. The king had executed his own steward. The world had been remade in a single morning. For Alara, Lyra, Cora, and the others, the return to the Rose Wing was a journey through a different castle. The guards at their posts looked at them not with indifference or pity, but with a new, wary respect. The servants they passed in the corridors dipped their heads, their glances now filled with a mixture of awe and curiosity. They were no longer just victims, they were the catalysts who had toppled a giant. It was a dizzying, terrifying form of fame. Back in the safety of their shared common room, the dam of their composure broke. Lyra wept openly, great, heaving sobs of relief that seemed to rack her entire frame. Cora did not hum, she sang, her voice clear and strong, a song of spring after a long winter. Fenna, Isolde, and Gwen clung to each other, laughing and crying in turn. The air, which had for so long been thick with dread, was now light, almost effervescent with the sheer, unbelievable fact of their deliverance. Alara stood slightly apart, watching her friends, her sisters in suffering. A profound joy for them swelled in her heart, but it was tempered by a strange, quiet solemnity. She had been the one to stand last in the witness box. She had felt the focus of the entire court, the weight of the king's gaze. She had seen the moment the gavel fell, not just on Silas and Valerius, but on an entire way of life. The victory was immense, but so was the responsibility that came with it. They were symbols now. What would they symbolize? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock. Captain Theron entered, his stern features softened by a rare expression of approval. "The king requests your presence in the map room, Alara," he said. "He wishes to speak with you all, but he asked for you first." The other women fell silent, their celebratory mood shifting into one of nervous anticipation. Lyra gave Alara's hand a quick, reassuring squeeze. "Go," she whispered. "He listens to you." Following Theron through the halls, Alara's mind raced. The map room was not the throne room, it was a place of strategy and planning. What could he want there now, in the immediate wake of the trial? The room was exactly as its name implied. One entire wall was dominated by a vast, meticulously detailed map of the kingdom, carved from polished wood and inlaid with mother of pearl to mark rivers and silver for the roads. King Kaelin stood before it, not as a ruler surveying his domains, but with his back to it, staring into the dying embers of a large fireplace. He had changed out of his formal attire and into a simple, dark tunic and trousers. He looked less like a king and more like a man shouldering a heavy burden. He turned as she entered, and Theron withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. "Alara," he said, his voice was quiet, laced with a fatigue she had never heard in him before. "Thank you for coming." "Your Majesty," she murmured, dipping into a curtsy. "Please," he gestured to a pair of chairs near the fire. "Sit. There is no need for formality here. Not after today." They sat, the crackle of the embers the only sound for a long moment. He studied her face, and she found she could hold his gaze without the old fear fluttering in her chest. "You were extraordinary today," he said finally. "What you said, the way you said it. You did not just testify. You gave the court its conscience." "I only told the truth," she replied, her voice soft. "That is what made it extraordinary," he said. "In a world of politics and power, unvarnished truth is the most revolutionary force of all." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I have passed 2 death sentences. I have ended 2 lives. It is a weight I do not carry lightly, even knowing it was just." Alara looked at him, truly looked at him. She saw the lines of stress around his eyes, the grim set of his mouth. The alpha power that usually radiated from him was muted, banked like the fire. In its place was a profound, human weariness. She felt a surprising impulse to offer comfort. "You gave us our lives back," she said. "The weight you carry, you took it from our shoulders and placed it upon your own. We can never repay that." Her words seemed to startle him. He looked at her, his deep eyes searching hers. "There is no debt, Alara. It was my duty. A duty I failed for far too long." He paused, as if choosing his next words with great care. "But the work is not done." Silas and Valerius were the symptoms, not the disease. The disease is the attitude that allowed them to thrive. It is the belief that some lives are worth less than others. He stood and walked to the great map, gesturing for her to join him. "This is my kingdom," he said, his voice gaining strength. "From the mountains in the north to the southern sea. What happened in my kitchen has happened in 100 other kitchens, in 1,000 fields, in countless workshops. The law I invoked today must become their law. The justice you witnessed must become their hope." He turned to her, his intensity returning, but it was a focused, determined energy now. "This is what I wished to speak to you about. The Citadel Welfare Council is the first step. But it is not enough. I need to know what it looks like from the ground. I need to understand what protection, truly means to an Omega in a remote village, what justice feels like to a beta servant in a merchant's house 100 miles from here. He placed a hand on the map, his fingers resting on the capital city. I am creating a new office. The Royal Commission for Equitable Justice. It will be headed by Magistrate Liana. But it will need investigators, listeners, people who can travel the kingdom and hear the stories that never make it to court. He looked at her, his gaze direct and unwavering. I want you to be a part of it. Alara felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Leave the citadel? Travel the kingdom? It was an idea so vast, so terrifyingly beyond the confines of her old life, that her mind could not immediately grasp it. Me? She breathed. But I am no investigator. I am just a cook. You are a woman who looked into the face of power and spoke the truth without flinching, he countered. You have a clarity that cannot be taught. You know the difference between a real grievance and a petty complaint because you have lived it. You can look into the eyes of a frightened Omega and make her feel believed, because you know what it is to be disbelieved. He was offering her not just a role, but a purpose. A mission. The question he had asked in the garden, "What do you want?" suddenly had a possible, tangible answer. She wanted to be the person she had needed 3 years ago. She wanted to be the listening ear she had never had. I do not know if I can, she whispered, the immensity of the offer overwhelming her. I am not asking for an answer now, he said gently. I am asking you to consider it. To discuss it with the others. Their perspectives will be just as vital. This is not a path you need to walk alone. He was not commanding her. He was inviting her. The respect in that gesture filled her with a warmth that rivaled the fire. I will think on it, she promised, her voice firmer now. And I will speak with the others. A genuine smile, the first she had ever seen from him, touched his lips. It transformed his face, easing the lines of care and making him look younger, more approachable. That is all I ask. As she left the map room, her mind was a whirlwind of maps and possibilities, of roads leading to places she had only ever heard of in stories. The castle, which had once been her entire world, now felt like just one room in a vast, sprawling house. When she returned to the Rose Wing and shared the king's proposal, the reaction was as varied as the women themselves. Lyra was immediately skeptical. It is a trap, she said, her old fears resurfacing. He sends us out into the kingdom to get us away from here, to silence our influence. But Cora's eyes shone with excitement. To travel? To see the sea? To actually help people like us? It sounds like a dream. Fenna, ever practical, asked, but would we be safe? Who would protect us on the road? Isolde and Gwen were hesitant, intrigued but terrified. They talked long into the night, their voices weaving a tapestry of fear, hope, and cautious ambition. For the first time, they were not just discussing survival. They were debating their future. They were making a choice. Later, as Alara lay in her soft bed, staring at the moonlit ceiling, she realized that the king's question had been a seed. In the fertile ground of their newfound safety, it had taken root. The trial had been the storm that cleared the dead wood. Now, they were being asked what they wanted to grow in the newly cleared space. And beneath all the practical considerations, beneath the fear and the hope, was the constant, low hum of that connection she felt to Kaelin. It was no longer just a pull, it was a resonance. His burden was her concern. His vision for the kingdom was becoming her own. She did not yet have the words for what it was, this bond that felt both terrifyingly immense and as natural as breathing. She only knew that in the echoing silence after the gavel's fall, the most important conversation had only just begun. The days following the trial were a study in quiet transformation. The public spectacle was over, but the real, deeper work was just beginning. Within the sunlit rooms of the Rose Wing, the 6 Omegas embarked on a journey more complex than any they had faced before. The journey of learning how to live without fear. It was not a switch that could be flipped. The ghosts of the past were tenacious. A slamming door from the corridor could make all 6 of them jump, their hearts leaping into their throats before their minds could register it was just a servant on an errand. The sight of a man with a similar build to Silas would send a jolt of ice through their veins, forcing them to look twice, to reassess the threat level of a world that was now, ostensibly, safe. King Kaelin, advised by Elder Maeve, understood this. He did not press Alara for an answer about the Royal Commission. Instead, he provided them with resources for a different kind of rebuilding. A gentle, soft-spoken therapist, a beta woman named Anya, the same healer who had first documented their injuries, began to meet with them daily, both as a group and individually. The first group session was a wall of silence. They sat in a circle, hands folded in their laps, eyes fixed on the floor. Trust was a currency they had been robbed of, and they were not about to spend it lightly on a stranger. Anya did not force them. She simply sat, her presence calm and patient. "You do not have to speak," she said, her voice a soft melody. "You only have to breathe. And know that in this room, for this hour, no one will hurt you. There is no task to complete, no pot to scrub, no overseer to avoid. There is only space. However, you need to fill it." It was Lyra who broke first, not with words, but with tears. Silent, helpless tears that streamed down her face as she stared at her own rough, scarred hands. The dam did not burst, but it cracked. The next day, Cora, encouraged by the safety of Lyra's vulnerability, spoke 3 halting sentences about the day her singing had been silenced by a backhanded blow from Silas. It was a start. While they healed, the political machinery of the Citadel ground on. With Lord Valerius's seat empty, a power vacuum had formed. Lord Bourdon and his faction, though chastened by the public verdict, were not defeated. They shifted their strategy from open opposition to subtle obstruction. They delayed the funding for the new Office of Protection. They questioned the qualifications of the proposed staff. They argued in council meetings that the king's focus should return to kingly matters, border security, trade agreements, and leave the domestic management to them. King Kaelin, however, was prepared. He had spent centuries learning the art of statecraft. He knew that momentum was everything. With Lord Evander as his key ally, he began to outmaneuver the old guard. He didn't just argue for the Office of Protection, he demonstrated its necessity. He had Captain Theron's investigators compile a preliminary, anonymized report of the complaints already trickling in from other parts of the castle and the city. A cook in a noble's house paid half wages, a stable hand beaten for a spooked horse, an Omega scullery maid harassed by a guardsman. He presented these not as isolated incidents, but as symptoms of the same disease he had just excised from his own household. "Shall we wait for these to fester into another Silas?" he asked the council, his voice dangerously calm. "Or shall we apply the lesson we have so bloodily learned?" He also made a shrewd economic argument, leveraging the support of the merchants' guilds that Evander had cultivated. "A stable, just kingdom is a prosperous kingdom," he stated. "Who will invest in a land where the workforce is terrorized? Where innovation is stifled by fear? The Office of Protection is not an expense, it is an investment in the future prosperity of us all." Faced with this combination of moral imperative and cold, hard practicality, Lord Bourdon's opposition began to crumble. The funding was approved. During this time, Kaelin was a constant, but not overbearing, presence in the periphery of the Omega's lives. He did not summon Alara to private meetings again. Instead, he visited the Rose Wing as a group, always with a clear and practical purpose. He brought drafts of the new charter for the Citadel Welfare Council, asking for their feedback on the language. He showed them the designs for the badge that officers of the new protection agency would wear, wanting to know which symbol felt more approachable and less intimidating to them. These visits were strategic. They reinforced their agency, making them active participants in the new world being built, not just its beneficiaries. And for Kaelin, they were a necessity. Being near Alara was like stepping into the sunlight after a long winter. The dormant bond, though unacknowledged, thrummed between them, a quiet current beneath the surface of their conversations about policy and design. He watched her blossom in these discussions, her insights sharpening, her voice growing more confident. Her courage, which had been forged in survival, was now being tempered into leadership. One afternoon, he found Alara alone in the common room, studying a map she had requested, a smaller, paper version of the great one in his map room. She had marked the capital and was tracing the roads with her finger, a faint line of concentration between her brows. She looked up as he entered, not with a startle, but with a small, composed smile. "Your Majesty." "Alara," he nodded, gesturing to the map. "Planning a journey?" "Just considering the scale of it all," she said, her gaze returning to the parchment. "It is one thing to know the kingdom is large. It is another to see all the places where people like us, people like I was, might be living in the same shadow. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. I have spoken with the others. Lyra is still afraid. Cora wants to go, but I worry her spirit is still too fragile for the harshness we might find. Fenna and Isolde have agreed to join the Citadel Council here, to make sure the changes within these walls are real and lasting. And you? Kaelin asked, his heart beating a little faster. I will go, she said, her voice firm. Gwen has agreed to come with me. We are not healers, and we are not warriors. But we are listeners, and I think the kingdom needs people who know how to listen. In that moment, Kaelin felt a surge of pride so fierce it stole his breath. This was not the broken woman he had found in the kitchen. This was a queen in the making, though neither of them would dare speak such a thought. The commission leaves in 3 weeks, he said. Magistrate Lyanna will be glad to have you. You and Gwen will have your own guard detail, handpicked by Theron. You will report directly to Lyanna, and she to me. Your safety is paramount. Thank you, she said. And then, after a pause, she added, for everything. For not just giving us a safe place to hide, but for giving us a reason to leave it. It was the most personal thing she had ever said to him. The air between them grew thick with unspoken words, with the pull of the bond that hummed like a plucked string. He wanted to tell her then, to speak of the connection that had guided his hand and now filled his heart. But he saw the determination in her eyes, the focus on the path ahead. This was her time to stand on her own, to define herself not by her trauma or by her bond to him, but by her own strength. So, he simply nodded, his gaze warm. The kingdom thanks you, Alara. More than it can ever say. He left her then, with her map and her future. The architecture of the new dawn was not just in laws and offices, it was being built in the quiet courage of a servant who had chosen to become a guardian, and in the patient heart of a king who loved her enough to let her fly. The journey ahead would be long, but for the first time, they were both walking their own paths, side by side, toward the same horizon. The 3 weeks of preparation for the Royal Commission's departure were a whirlwind of a different sort. For Alara, whose life had been governed by the monotonous, brutal rhythm of the kitchen, this new tempo was both exhilarating and exhausting. It was a rhythm of learning, of planning, of stepping into an identity she was still weaving thread by thread. Her days were no longer filled with the scent of bread and broth, but with the smell of parchment and ink. She and Gwen were given a small, bright office adjacent to Magistrate Lyanna's chambers. They spent their mornings being tutored by Lyanna herself on the basics of kingdom law, specifically the statutes pertaining to servant rights and overseer authority, laws that had existed on the books for centuries but had been as dormant and faded as the parchment they were written on, until now. Alara proved to have a keen, intuitive mind for it. She understood the spirit of the law, the intent behind the dry words, because she had lived in the void where that intent had been absent. She could look at a clause about reasonable discipline, and immediately pinpoint how a man like Silas would twist it into a weapon. Here, she said to Lyanna one morning, her finger resting on a line of text. It says a servant may not be struck without just and documented cause. But who does the documenting? The overseer. It is a circle that traps the victim. There must be a separate, neutral logbook, kept under lock and key by someone outside the chain of command. Lyanna looked at her, a slow smile spreading across her usually stern face. Precisely. You see the flaw not as a scholar, but as a strategist. This is invaluable. In the afternoons, they trained with Captain Theron. Not in swordsmanship, but in awareness. He taught them how to read a room, to sense a lie in a shifting gaze, to identify the subtle signs of coercion in a household. He drilled them on basic safety protocols, never traveling alone, establishing meeting points, using the small, sharp signal whistles he issued to them. Your greatest weapon will not be a blade, Theron told them, his voice gruff but his eyes earnest. It will be your perception. And your greatest shield will be the knowledge that the full authority of the crown stands behind every word you speak. Throughout this, King Kaelin was a distant, yet deeply present, architect of their mission. He reviewed their itinerary, scrutinized the list of towns and estates they would visit, and personally interviewed the 4 guards assigned to their detail. His involvement was that of a sovereign ensuring the success of a critical state function, but those with keen eyes, like Elder Maeve and Captain Theron, saw the deeper current. They saw how he always found a reason to pass by their office when the door was open, his gaze lingering on Alara as she bent over a map, her brow furrowed in concentration. They saw how he insisted on the finest, most durable traveling cloaks and boots for her and Gwen, garments that were practical but made of a wool and leather far superior to what was standard issue. It was the care of an alpha for his mate, expressed not through words or touch, but through the meticulous ensuring of her safety and comfort. For Alara, his presence was becoming the steady drumbeat to the new song of her life. She no longer felt a jolt of nervousness when he appeared, instead, she felt a sense of grounding. His approval, when he nodded at a point she made in a briefing, felt like a sunbeam, warming her from the inside. The connection was a quiet understanding, a language spoken in glances and the shared space of a common purpose. She didn't have a name for what she felt, only that the world seemed right when he was near, and that the thought of leaving the citadel for months was accompanied by a strange, hollow ache that had everything to do with the distance it would put between them. One evening, a week before their departure, she was working late, tracing the commission's route on her personal map by the light of a single lamp. The castle was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire in the hearth. A soft knock came at the door. It was Kalen. He carried a small, flat box made of dark wood. "Alara," he said, "I saw your light. I hope I am not disturbing you." "Not at all, Your Majesty," she said, setting down her quill. "I was just finalizing the first leg of the journey." He came to stand beside her, looking down at the map. His proximity sent a familiar, warm shiver through her. He pointed to a region in the northern foothills. "The weather turns early here. Be sure Magistrate Liana plans for that. The passes can be treacherous with even a dusting of snow." "I will make a note of it," she said, her voice slightly breathless. He was silent for a moment, then he placed the wooden box on the table beside her map. "This is for you, for your journey." Puzzled, she opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dark velvet, was a compass. But it was like no compass she had ever seen. The casing was polished silver, intricately engraved with swirling patterns that resembled both vines and wolves. The needle, a sliver of gleaming obsidian, seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting it carefully from its case. The metal was warm to the touch. "It is more than a navigational tool," Kalen said, his voice low. "It is enchanted. The needle will not point north. It will point home, to this castle. No matter where you are, no matter how lost you may feel, it will always show you the way back." Alara looked from the compass to his face, her eyes wide with emotion. The gift was too personal, too profound. It was not a tool for a royal agent, it was a promise from a man to a woman. It was his way of saying, "Go, do what you must, but know that you are anchored here. With me." Tears pricked at her eyes. "Your Majesty, I cannot accept this. It is too much." "You can," he said softly, his gaze holding hers. "And you will. Because I need to know that you can always find your way back. The kingdom needs your work. But He hesitated, the unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "I will need to know you are safe." Their eyes locked. In the quiet of the room, the hum of the bond was deafening. She could feel the truth of it then, not as a vague pull, but as a concrete, undeniable force. It was in the depth of his concern, in the intensity of his gaze, in the sheer, overwhelming rightness of his presence. He was her home. The castle was just the place he lived. She didn't say it, neither did he. But in that moment, an understanding passed between them as clear as any spoken vow. "Thank you," she whispered, her fingers closing around the warm silver of the compass. "I will treasure it." He gave a single, slow nod, his eyes saying everything his words could not. Then, he turned and left her alone with the map, the fire, and the compass needle that pointed unerringly toward the heart of the castle, toward him. She was a cartographer now, not just of the kingdom's roads, but of her own soul. And with every beat of her heart, she was mapping a course that led irrevocably back to him. The journey ahead was necessary, but the compass in her hand was a constant reminder of the destination that awaited her return. The courtyard of the Ivory Citadel was a scene of controlled chaos on the morning of the Royal Commission's departure. Horses stamped their hooves on the cobblestones, their breath pluming in the crisp autumn air. Wagons were loaded with supplies, document chests, and the practical necessities for a journey that would span seasons. The air crackled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, a feeling shared by the travelers and those seeing them off. Alara stood beside Gwen, both dressed in the sturdy, well-made traveling clothes the king had provided. They looked less like former kitchen servants and more like junior officials, which, Alara supposed with a jolt of surrealism, was exactly what they were. She clutched the strap of her leather satchel, inside which, carefully wrapped, was the silver compass. Its constant, gentle warmth against her side was a secret comfort. Lyra, Cora, Fenna, and Isolde had come to see them off. The goodbyes were tearful and clung to tightly. "You will write?" Lyra asked, her voice thick with emotion, her earlier fears now transformed into a fierce, protective worry for those leaving the nest. At every major stop, Gwen promised, her own eyes shining. "Be careful," Cora whispered, hugging Alara tightly. "Remember the songs if you are afraid. They will give you strength." Fenna and Isolde offered practical advice about preserving food and checking the wheels of the wagons, their way of showing love. The finality of the moment settled on Alara. She was leaving the only home she had known for years, a place that had been both a prison and a sanctuary. She was stepping into the vast, unknown expanse of the kingdom, armed with nothing but her wits and her hard-won truth. A hush fell over the courtyard as King Kaelin emerged from the main keep. He was not alone. Lord Evander and Captain Theron flanked him, a display of consolidated power for any watching eyes. He moved through the crowd with a regal grace, offering words of encouragement to Magistrate Lyanna and a firm nod to the guards. But his path inevitably led to Alara and Gwen. "Magistrate Lyanna, your mission carries the hopes of the crown," he said formally, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "Bring the light of justice to the shadows." "We will, your majesty," Lyanna replied with a deep bow. He then turned to the two Omegas. His gaze rested on Gwen first. "Gwen, your courage is an inspiration. The kingdom will be better for your voice." Gwen blushed and curtsied deeply. "Thank you, your majesty." Finally, his eyes met Alara's. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them. The formal mask of the king softened almost imperceptibly. He did not offer her a hand or a touch. That would have been too much, too revealing for the watching court. But his words, though spoken for all to hear, were for her alone. "Alara," he said, and her name on his lips felt like a private benediction. "You carry with you the truth that reshaped this citadel. See that it reshapes the kingdom. We will be waiting for your return." The "we" was a masterful touch, implying the entire court, the whole citadel. But Alara heard the singular meaning beneath it. "I will be waiting." She bowed her head, her heart thundering. "I will not fail, your majesty." He gave a final, slow nod, his eyes lingering on her for a heartbeat longer than was strictly proper, then he stepped back. It was the signal. Magistrate Lyanna gave the order, and the company began to move, a slow serpent of horses and wagons winding its way through the great gates. Alara did not look back as they passed under the portcullis. She kept her eyes forward, on the road ahead, on her duty. But her left hand slipped into her satchel, her fingers finding the cool metal of the compass. She didn't need to look at it to know the needle was pointing behind her, back to the man growing smaller in the distance. The first few days of travel were a blur of new sensations. The sheer scale of the world outside the castle walls was overwhelming. Endless forests of gold and crimson, rolling hills that stretched to the horizon, villages where life moved at a slower, more rooted pace. Alara and Gwen shared a small wagon, spending the hours reviewing case files, discussing strategies with Lyanna, and simply watching the kingdom they were meant to serve unfold before them. At their first stop, a large market town 2 days' ride from the capital, the reality of their mission hit home. They set up in the town hall, and Lyanna announced that the royal commission was there to hear grievances. At first, there was only suspicious silence. Then, a lone beta woman, a weaver, came forward. Her hands trembled as she spoke of a merchant who refused to pay her for a large order, threatening her with ruin if she complained. She had heard what the king had done in the capital. She had dared to hope. As Lyanna took down the official testimony, Alara and Gwen sat with the woman, their presence a quiet reassurance. "You are not alone," Alara told her, the words she herself had once needed to hear. "Your voice matters." The woman wept with relief. Word spread. By the end of the day, a small line had formed. Not all the cases were as clear-cut as the one in the citadel. There were disputes over wages, over working conditions, complex webs of local power and tradition. But the pattern was the same, the powerless afraid to speak, and the powerful assuming they never would. Back in the citadel, Kalen threw himself into his work with a relentless energy. The absence of Alara was a physical ache, a constant, low-grade tension in his chest. The bond, now acknowledged in the quiet of his own mind, was a tether stretched taut over the miles. He found himself looking toward the north window often, as if he could see her progress. He met daily with Fenna and Isolde on the Citadel Welfare Council. Their insights were sharp and practical, born of lived experience. They helped draft new guidelines for servant contracts and designed a system of rotational oversight to prevent any single overseer from accumulating too much unchecked power. Under their watchful eyes, the changes within the castle began to take real, tangible root. Lyra, to everyone's surprise, found her calling not in policy, but in action. She began working with Captain Theron, training to become one of the first officers of the new Office of Protection. Her deep-seated suspicion and knowledge of a predator's mind made her unnervingly good at identifying potential problems before they escalated. And Cora's songs, once a silent comfort in the kitchens, now filled the halls of the Rose Wing and began to spread through the servant quarters. They were songs of resilience, of hope, of a new dawn. They became the unofficial anthems of the changing times. The citadel was healing, growing stronger without Silas's poison. But for Kalen, the heart of the castle felt like it was traveling down a dusty road to the north. Each night, he would stand on his balcony, the compass he kept as a mirror to her own hidden in his hand, and he would look to the stars, imagining the same sky stretching over her. The work of a king was never done, but for the first time in 4 centuries, the patience of an alpha was being tested by the quiet, desperate longing for his mate. The parting was a necessary trial, but it was in this separation that the bond, silent and unclaimed, began to truly root itself in the fertile ground of their shared purpose and growing love. The Royal Commission's journey became a traveling tapestry, its threads woven from the countless stories of the kingdom's people. They moved from the bustling market towns of the Central Plains into the rugged, forest-clad foothills of the Northern Range. The air grew colder, the people more reserved, their lives etched by the harshness of the mountain winters and the isolation of their valleys. In the town of Oakhaven, nestled in a deep valley, they encountered their first significant resistance. The town was dominated by the timber trade, and the logging overseer, a hulking alpha named Borin, ruled with a fist sheathed in the velvet glove of local tradition. When Magistrate Liana announced the commission's presence, Borin himself appeared at the town hall, a condescending smile on his face. "Magistrate," he said, his voice a low rumble. "A pleasure. But I assure you, we have no need of your services here. My people are well cared for. We have our own ways." Liana was unmoved. "The king's law is the same for Oakhaven as it is for the capital, Master Borin. We are here to ensure it is understood." For 2 days, the hall remained empty. The silence was a wall, built by Borin's influence and the deep-seated fear of the loggers and their families. Alara felt the familiar chill of enforced silence, a ghost from her past. She and Gwen didn't wait in the hall. Instead, they walked through the town, visiting the communal well, the small temple, the timber yards themselves. They didn't ask direct questions. They simply talked. Alara complimented a woman on the sturdy stitching of her child's coat. Gwen asked an old man about the best wood for carving. It was in the timber yard that Alara saw it. A young beta man, no older than she was, favoring his left leg, a fresh, poorly hidden bruise blooming on his temple. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, Alara saw a reflection of her own former self, the terror, the shame, the desperate hope that someone might see. She didn't approach him. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, a look that said, "I see you. I know." That evening, as Alara was reviewing maps by the light of a lantern in the inn's common room, the young man appeared at the door. He was trembling. They said you listen," he whispered. "We do," Alara said, her voice soft. She gestured for him to sit. "What is your name?" "Yorin," he said, his voice barely audible. He spoke in a rushed, terrified whisper. He told them of Borin's disciplinary measures, broken bones passed off as logging accidents, wages withheld for imagined slights, the constant, grinding threat that ensured no one spoke out. The logging camp, he revealed, was a world unto itself, a place where the king's law had never reached. It was the crack in the dam. Emboldened by Yoren's courage, 2 other loggers came forward the next day, then a cook from the camp's kitchen. The evidence mounted, painting a picture of brutal exploitation that mirrored Silas's reign, but on a larger, more physically dangerous scale. Magistrate Lyanna acted with swift, surgical precision. Using the king's authority, she placed Borin under arrest and installed a temporary overseer from her own guard detail. The public reading of the charges in Oakhaven Square was a scene of stunned silence, followed by a wave of palpable relief so powerful it felt like a change in the weather. The commission had not just listened, it had acted. The news began to spread ahead of them, carried by riders and merchants. The king's justice was not just words. It had teeth. Through it all, the silver compass was Alara's talisman. Each night, no matter how exhausted she was, she would take it out and watch the obsidian needle quiver, holding its unwavering course back to the citadel. It was a ritual that grounded her, a reminder of the man who had believed in her enough to set her on this path. Her feelings for Kaelin were no longer a confused pull, they were a steady, warm certainty growing in her heart with every league they traveled. She missed him with an ache that was both a pain and a comfort, a proof of the bond that distance could not break. Back in the citadel, the void left by the commission's departure was filled with a different kind of work. King Kaelin, with Lord Evander's counsel, was engaged in the delicate political dance of consolidating his power. The public execution of Silas and Valerius had been a shockwave, now, he had to manage the aftershocks. Lord Bourdon's faction, though weakened, was not idle. They could not openly oppose the king's popular new reforms, so they attacked through proxy and procedure. They championed minor nobles with dubious claims to lands redistributed from Valerius's estate, forcing lengthy legal battles. They nitpicked the budgets for the new agencies, demanding endless reviews and audits designed to strangle them with bureaucracy. Kaelin met their obstruction with a combination of royal prerogative and public appeal. He used his authority to fast-track the land settlements, presenting them as the crown restoring justice to those wronged by the corrupt steward. He invited guild masters and prominent merchants to view the ledgers of the new Office of Protection, showcasing its efficiency and the drop in productivity sapping disputes within the castle. He was winning the war of perception, turning the old guard's attempts at obstruction into evidence of their own irrelevance. His greatest source of strength, however, came from within the castle itself. The Citadel Welfare Council, led by Fenna and Isolde, was a resounding success. They implemented a fair and transparent system for shift assignments and promotions. They established a rotating council of servants who could bring concerns directly to the king's stewards, bypassing layers of potentially corrupt oversight. The change in morale among the staff was palpable. The castle was no longer a place of dread, but one of order and, increasingly, of pride. Lyra, now a junior officer in the Office of Protection, found her past was her greatest asset. She could walk into a kitchen or a stable and, with a single glance, sense the dynamic. She knew the signs of a bully, the subtle language of fear. She intervened in situations not with the brute force of a guard, but with the unshakable authority of someone who understood the anatomy of abuse. She became a legend among the servants, a protector who was one of their own. And Cora's songs had evolved. They were no longer just about survival, they were ballads. She wrote a stirring song about the day the king came to the kitchens, a hauntingly beautiful melody about Alara's testimony, and a rousing anthem about the Royal Commission's journey north. Her music became the soundtrack of the new era, weaving the story of their collective transformation into the very culture of the Citadel. Kaelin watched this internal transformation with a deep sense of fulfillment. This was the kingdom he had always wanted to rule, not one held together by fear, but one strengthened by justice and mutual respect. Yet, his own heart was a kingdom divided. His public days were filled with the work of a sovereign, but his private moments were haunted by Alara's absence. He kept a detailed map in his war room, and each evening, Captain Theron would bring him a dispatch from Magistrate Lyanna. Kaelin would then move a small, silver wolf figurine, a private, sentimental token, along the inked route, marking her progress. He devoured the reports, but his eyes always sought the passages that mentioned Alara. Alara's empathy proved crucial in gaining the trust of the witnesses in Oakhaven. Her insight into the dynamics of the logging camp was invaluable. Each word was a brushstroke painting the portrait of the remarkable woman she was becoming. He would hold his own compass, its needle pointing steadfastly north, towards her. The bond was a constant, low thrum in his blood, a connection that stretched across hills and rivers. He was a king building a legacy, but he was also an alpha waiting for his mate, learning that the deepest strength was not in holding on, but in having the faith to let go, so she could return to him not as a rescued servant, but as an equal partner, her own journey of discovery complete. The weft of justice she was weaving across the kingdom would, he knew, ultimately strengthen the warp of their destined bond, creating a tapestry that would last for ages. The first snow found the royal commission in the high-walled town of Stone Creek, a place where the mountains seemed to lean in, their peaks lost in a swirl of gray cloud. The air was thin and sharp, and the silence here was of a different quality than in Oakhaven, not born of fear, but of the immense, imposing landscape. The people were as hardy and unyielding as the granite they quarried. Here, the challenge was not a single brutal overseer, but something more insidious. A deeply entrenched system of debt bondage that ensnared entire families for generations. The quarrymaster, a shrewd, elderly beta named Halvor, was a pillar of the community, known for his generosity in advancing credit to families during lean winters, credit that, with impossible interest, could never be repaid, binding them to his quarry in perpetuity. When Magistrate Liana announced their purpose, Halvor welcomed them with open arms and a veneer of cooperation. He offered them the warmest rooms in the inn, provided detailed, and utterly falsified, ledgers, and spoke eloquently of the family-like structure of his enterprise. He was a spider, and his web was made of paper and promises. For days, the commission made no headway. The quarry workers, their faces etched with a resignation that spoke of lifetimes of submission, would not speak against Halvor. To them, he was not a tyrant, he was the devil they knew, the one who put food, however meager, on their tables. The concept of the king's law felt as distant and intangible as the sun behind the winter clouds. Alara felt a familiar frustration. This was a more complex enemy than Silas or Borin. You could not arrest a ledger. You could not execute a tradition. She spent her days in the quarry, not asking questions, but working alongside the women who broke the smaller stones, her hands growing raw and cold. She listened to their talk of children, of the harsh winter ahead, of the debt that would be passed to their grandchildren. It was a despair so profound it had become mundane. One evening, a young mother named Anya, whose hands were scarred and trembling from a lifetime of crushing rock, approached Alara as she warmed herself by the communal fire. She didn't speak of Halvor. She spoke of her daughter, a bright girl of 6 with a fever that wouldn't break. The healer requires silver, Anya whispered, her eyes hollow. Silver we do not have. Halvor will advance it, of course. He always does. It was the same story, repeated for generations. A illness, a debt, a life bound to the quarry. That night, Alara did not look at her compass. Instead, she sat with Magistrate Liana and Gwen, a new, fierce determination in her eyes. We cannot attack the debt itself, she said. It is too woven into their lives. We have to break the cycle. We have to give them an alternative. Her idea was simple, but revolutionary. Using the discretionary fund granted by the king, the commission would pay the healer directly. Not as a loan, but as a grant. It would be a single act, for a single family, but its impact would be a pebble dropped into the still pond of Stone Creek. The next day, when the healer was paid with the king's coin, the news spread through the town like wildfire. It was not the arrest of a villain, but an act of pure, unexpected grace. The wall of silence, built over generations, developed a hairline fracture. Anya, her daughter's fever broken, was the first to come forward. Then, a man whose son had a talent for letters but could never afford a scribe's apprenticeship. Another, whose wife needed medicine. The commission, led by Alara's empathetic strategy, began to selectively intervene, not to erase the old debts, but to prevent the creation of new ones. They were not just enforcing the law, they were planting the seeds of a new economy, one based on hope instead of despair. Halvor, seeing his power base erode, grew desperate. He could not fight the king's magistrate directly, so he resorted to older, darker methods. One night, as Alara returned to her room from a late meeting, a shadow detached itself from the alleyway. A man, his face hidden by a hood, moved towards her with clear intent. Before he could reach her, one of Theron's guards, who had been watching from the shadows, had him pinned against the wall. The would-be assailant was not a professional, but one of Halvor's indebted thugs, offered a reduction in his debt for this one terrible task. The attempt on Alara, for it could be seen as nothing else, galvanized Magistrate Lyanna. She had the legal grounds she needed. Halvor was arrested not just for corruption, but for conspiracy to harm a royal agent. As he was led away, the people of Stone Creek did not cheer. They watched in a silence that was now thoughtful, weighing the old master's fear against the king's surprising mercy. The shadow in the snow had been confronted, not with a sword, but with a healer's fee and the unshakable courage of a young woman who refused to be intimidated. Back in the citadel, the news of the attempt on Alara's life reached Kaelin like a physical blow. The alpha within him roared, a primal urge to ride north with his entire guard and reduce Stone Creek to rubble. The bond, which had been a steady hum of connection, became a searing brand of protective fury. He spent a night pacing the length of his chambers, the compass in his hand feeling not like a comfort, but a condemnation of his decision to send her into danger. It was Elder Maeve who found him at dawn, his face haggard. "You feel her danger as your own," she said, her voice calm. "That is the nature of the bond. But recall, Kaelin, the woman she is." She did not falter. She did not run. She used the attack to strengthen her position. "You chose a queen, not a porcelain doll. To treat her as one now would be to dishonor the strength you admire in her." Her words were a bucket of cold water. He was thinking like a possessive alpha, not a king, and certainly not like the man Alara needed him to be. He forced the rage down, channeling it into a cold, focused directive. He doubled the guard detail for the commission and sent a royal decree, signed and sealed, that granted Lyanna the authority to summarily dismiss and replace any local official who obstructed their work. The message was clear: an attack on the commission was an attack on the crown itself. The incident had a ripple effect within the citadel as well. When Lyra heard, she requested, and was granted, permission to accelerate her training. Cora wrote a new song, a fierce, protective ballad about a shield in the snow, which became an instant anthem among the guards and servants alike. The attempt to harm one of their own had only strengthened the resolve of the entire community. Kaelin stood again before his map, moving the silver wolf figurine to Stone Creek. His fear for her was now intertwined with a soaring, fierce pride. She was in the heart of the storm, and she was not just surviving, she was changing the weather. The separation was agony, but with each report, each act of her courage, the bond between them deepened, evolving from a fated pull into a chosen, earned respect. He was not just waiting for his mate, he was witnessing the forging of a legend. The incident in Stone Creek marked a turning point for the Royal Commission. They were no longer just investigators, they were a symbol of the Crown's unyielding will. News of Halvor's arrest and the King's swift, severe response raced ahead of them on the swiftest horses, carried by merchants and travelers. The commission arrived in the next town, a mining settlement called Ironhold, to find the local overseer waiting for them at the gates, his ledgers open and his demeanor nervously cooperative. But Ironhold presented a different kind of challenge. It wasn't malice or corruption, but a deep, systemic despair. The mines were played out, the veins of iron thin and unprofitable. The people were not trapped by debt, but by a dying industry and a landscape that offered little else. The air was thick with the dust of defeat. Magistrate Lyanna's legal prowess was of little use here. You could not legislate a mountain to give up more ore. For the first time, the commission faced a problem that justice alone could not solve. They listened to the miners speak of their fathers and grandfathers who had worked the same seams, of the slow, grinding decline, of the hopelessness that seeped into the very timber of their houses. Alara walked through the quiet, dusty streets, her heart aching with a new kind of empathy. This was not the sharp, specific pain of a bruise or a threat. It was the chronic, suffocating pain of a future with no light. She thought of Kaelin's map, of the vast kingdom he ruled. A king's justice could protect people from each other, but could it protect them from oblivion? One afternoon, she and Gwen climbed a ridge overlooking the town. The view was starkly beautiful, a panorama of sharp peaks and deep valleys painted in shades of gray and white. It feels like the end of the world, Gwen murmured, her breath misting in the cold air. Alara's fingers found the compass in her pocket, its needle pointing south, towards home, towards him. She thought of the citadel, not as a castle, but as a hub, a place of resources and knowledge. An idea, fragile and tentative, began to form. That evening, in a meeting with the town elders, weary, resigned men who had seen all hope mined out of their hills, Alara did not speak of laws or rights. She spoke of possibilities. The king's concern is not only for your obedience, but for your prosperity, she began, her voice clear in the quiet room. These mountains have given you iron for generations. What else can they give? The elders looked at her with blank skepticism. One laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Stone and snow, girl. That is what they give now. What about the stone itself? Alara pressed, her idea taking shape. I've seen the colors in the cliffs, the deep red, the veined green. In the capital, such stone is prized for inlay work, for carvings. And the snow, the pure water from these peaks is legendary. Could it be bottled, traded? The high pastures, is there a way to breed the mountain goats for their wool, a wool that could be finer and warmer than any from the lowlands? She was not an expert in any of these things. She was a cook, a listener. But she was weaving threads of observation into a tapestry of potential. She was offering them a new map of their own home. One of the elders, a man who had been silent, his eyes sharp and intelligent, leaned forward. My grandfather spoke of a stone like that. A deep blue, like a winter sky. He said it was worthless. But that was a long time ago. Magistrate Liana, seeing the shift, immediately pledged the commission's support. They would send for surveyors from the capital, experts in stone and husbandry. They would use the king's authority to secure trade routes and find markets. It was not a solution, but it was a seed. It was the first spark of hope Ironhold had seen in a generation. As they prepared to leave Ironhold, the mood was different. It was not the triumphant justice of Oakhaven or the wary relief of Stone Creek. It was a cautious, budding determination. The people lined the streets to see them off, not as saviors, but as partners. The elder with the sharp eyes pressed a small, rough piece of deep blue stone into Alara's hand. For the king, he said gruffly. A sample. The journey back south began. The work of the commission was largely done. They had established a precedent, broken the back of the most egregious abuses, and planted the seeds of economic renewal in the most desperate places. The return trip was faster, the roads familiar, the mood among the guards and officials one of weary accomplishment. For Alara, the southward journey was an internal pilgrimage. Each league brought her closer to the citadel, and with that proximity, the hum of the bond intensified, becoming a palpable, thrilling current in her blood. She was no longer the woman who had left, terrified and uncertain. She had stood before corrupt power and unyielding despair, and she had not broken. She had led. She had innovated. She had a pocket full of stories and a heart full of a love that had been tested and tempered by distance and trial. She spent the long hours in the wagon not studying law, but thinking of Kaelin. Not as the majestic king who had saved her, but as the weary man by the fire, the strategist in the map room, the one who had trusted her with his kingdom's most vulnerable people and with a compass that pointed to his heart. The fear was gone, replaced by a sure, steady longing. She was not returning to her protector. She was returning to her partner. One clear, cold night, as they camped within sight of the citadel's lights, a mere day's ride away, Alara stood at the edge of the camp, the silver compass open in her palm. The obsidian needle quivered, pointing directly at the distant, torch-lit spires. It was no longer pulling her home, it was confirming she had arrived. Magistrate Liana came to stand beside her. You have changed this kingdom, Alara, she said quietly. More than you know. Alara closed her fingers around the compass, its warmth a constant against her skin. The kingdom changed me, magistrate. She took a deep breath, the air sharp and sweet. I am ready to go home. Back in the citadel, Kaelin stood on his balcony, as he had every night of her absence. But tonight was different. A scout had ridden hard to bring the news. The commission was camped a day out. They would arrive tomorrow. The wait was almost over. The silver wolf on his map was poised at the very gates. The bond was a live wire, singing with anticipation. He could almost feel her, a bright, determined presence on the horizon, drawing closer with every beat of his heart. He looked down at the compass in his hand, its needle pointing unerringly north, towards her camp. Tomorrow, it would finally point to the ground beneath his feet. The architect of his new kingdom was coming home. And the king, who had learned the patience of both a ruler and a man in love, was ready to meet the woman she had become. The great gates of the ivory citadel stood open, not in defense, but in welcome. Sunlight, pale and wintry, glinted off the stones, washing the courtyard in a clean, clear light. A crowd had gathered, guards in polished armor, servants who had once bowed their heads in fear now standing with quiet pride, nobles whose world had been remade, watching with complex expressions. At the center of it all stood King Kalen. He wore no crown, only the simple authority of his presence, his eyes fixed on the gateway. A trumpet sounded, a clear, bright note that cut through the cold air. Then, they emerged. Magistrate Liana first, her back straight, her face etched with the gravity and triumph of their mission. Behind her, the guards, their standards flying. And then, Alara. She did not look like the woman who had left. She walked with a straight-backed confidence that had been earned in town squares and quarry yards, her gaze clear and steady, taking in the scene before her. Her eyes found his across the crowded courtyard, and in that single, silent moment, the months of separation, the miles of road, the whispered fears and the soaring hopes, all collapsed into a perfect, profound understanding. He moved then, not as a king to a subject, but as a man to his destiny. He met her halfway, the crowd parting before them like a sea. They stopped, a breath apart. The entire citadel, the entire kingdom, seemed to hold its breath with them. Alara, he said, and her name was a vow, a welcome, a homecoming. Kalen, she replied, her voice soft but unwavering, a promise returned. He did not embrace her. He did not need to. The bond between them, once a silent pull, now sang a note so pure and so powerful it was a force unto itself, visible in the way the air shimmered around them, in the way every heart in the courtyard beat in sudden, inexplicable unison. He simply offered his hand, palm up. And she, the servant who had become a savior, the victim who had become a voice, the woman who had mapped her own soul, placed her hand in his. The touch was not a beginning, but a completion. It was the final piece of a puzzle, the last word in a story long written in the stars. The shadows had been scoured from the kitchen, the silence had been broken across the kingdom, and in the sun-drenched courtyard, a king and his queen stood together, their joined hands a testament to a truth more powerful than any law. That even the deepest darkness must eventually yield to the dawn. The story of the cook and the king was over. The legend of the queen who had risen from the ashes of fear, and the king who had loved her enough to let her fly, was just beginning.